Welcome all. We're all happy to be here together again. And we're delighted and thank the IMF for providing us as host, particularly in this very busy time of the interim committee meetings. They've been, and the staff, as always, of the IMF has done a great job in helping the Bretton Woods Committee pursue its duties. I also want to thank very much the sponsors of this meeting, which are UBS, and of course the chairman of UBS, Axel Weber, will be on the agenda later in the day. Very happy to have them, and thanks to him and his bank, and SICBA, who are long-standing supporters of the Bretton Woods Committee. We're very grateful for their help. Today, well, actually, I'm supposed to tell you about your cell phones and so forth. I want you to know that this year I turned mine off. If you do the same, we'd all be happy. And also to say we're going right through, no coffee break or anything, ending up with a reception at about 5:30. Today we're here to discuss economic, political, technical shifts that are disrupting major sectors of the world, actually, and challenging everybody to see how we can deal with things differently for the future. We have a very distinguished group here, and we're ready to start, I believe. My one great regret is that Jim Wolfenson, who was scheduled to be here at the last minute, couldn't quite make it, and but he sent his greatest, warmest wishes, and we'll be in touch with him again. Now, our co-chair, Jim Colby, who's here. Jim, as you well know, has served for 22 years as a congressman from Arizona. 22 years, young fella still. He's stepping in for Jim for the first session of our agenda today. And our leading guest will be the president of the World Bank, Mr. Jim Yong Kim, who I believe is very close to being. He's here. Good. We're delighted. In that case, Jim, would you come up and introduce our leading speaker?
Thank you. Dr. Kim, how are you? Great. So good to see you again. Thank you. We come from opposite sides of the stage here to say hello to each other here, but Dr. Kim, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Congressman
once
Colby.
again,
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you here. I think everybody, we really don't need a lot of introduction for Dr. Kim. He's been with us before, and I think everybody knows his distinguished background, but I thought it was interesting to note that since we're approaching the 75th anniversary, that you are the 12th president of the World Bank, and we appreciate your making time in your schedule to be with us here today. You're finishing up almost 6 years now as president of the bank, and with a very distinguished career in education as president of Dartmouth College and in medicine at Harvard University, and a variety of other places that he's worked in public service. But certainly now he's in a role which is one of great importance. And Dr. Kim, I'd like to really just start off by saying, you know, in the 6 years that you've been president, we've seen a lot of changes that have taken place in the world, in the economies of the world today. And I'm just wondering if you might, as a broad question to get us started here, just tell us what your vision, if you were to imagine, look into the crystal ball and think about what the economy is going to look like 1 year, 5 years from now, what do you think it's going to be, and how does the World Bank fit into that? How is it going to have to adapt in order to adjust to the changes that are taking place in the world economy today that we're seeing?
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to thank members of the Bretton Woods Committee, because so many of you have helped us on IDA, before IDA 18, and also with the discussions that we're continuing to have on the capital increase. And so the Bretton Woods Committee members have been just a really great ally in this battle. And I also wanted to thank you, Congressman Colby. You may not remember, but when I was a young whippersnapper, I came to talk to you about AIDS funding, if you remember.
I do remember that.
So at a time when there was great danger of the world turning their backs on the 20+ million people living with HIV when there was treatment available, President Bush, of course, was a great hero, and Africans still remember him as being this incredibly visionary leader who was in favor of HIV treatment. But before that happened, you were extremely supportive of us and saved many, many millions of lives. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
But
for your work.
in terms of, there's been so much happening. Let me just, look, I don't know exactly what the world of work or what the economy is going to look like in 5 or 10 years, but there are people who are putting out very specific visions of what it's going to look like. And let me just give you one of them. Jack Ma, who's the CEO of Alibaba, says, and he's been saying this publicly, he said to me, he said, every single muscle-powered job will be replaced by machines. And the other thing he says, which is really even more challenging, is that every single knowledge-based job will also be replaced by machines through artificial intelligence. And he says, my grandfather worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and he felt very busy. I work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and I feel very busy. My children will work 3 hours a day, 3 days a week, and they'll feel very busy, right? So I don't know if that's true, but then we have to step back and say, so if at least part of that is true, what does it mean? It means that everyone will have access to broadband internet very soon. Many people say by 2025, and everywhere I go in the world, I see this happening, that once they get access to broadband, even if they don't own a smartphone, they have access to one. They can look at one. And so everyone will know how everyone else lives. That's going to happen very, very soon. And then, you can, listening to different pundits about what's going to happen to jobs, probably the one thing everyone agrees on is that a lot of the low-skilled tasks will be taken over by machines. An example of that in Bangladesh, one of the assumptions that many development economists made was that, well, technology may take over, but you'll always need human hands for making garments or making shoes. Bangladesh is the most efficient and probably one of the largest garment industries in the world. And from 2003 to 2010, they created 300,000 jobs a year in the garment industry. Last year was 60,000, and it's going down because even in Bangladesh, they're buying robots, German robots, who now make the garments. They're called sew bots, S-E-W bots. And so if we see that happening, the question we have to ask is then if the traditional path of agriculture to light manufacturing to heavy industry is not going to be a path that many poor countries can go down, what are people going to do? And especially people with higher aspirations, the more they see the internet, the more they see how everyone else lives, their aspirations go up. And so we found ourselves having to innovate in just about every area. So 2 goals, end poverty, boost shared prosperity. And the way to get there is economic growth, but in this case, inclusive, sustainable economic growth. The second area is to build resilience. We need to help countries all over the world adapt to things like climate change and refugees and pandemics and so many other overlapping crises that we're living through right now. And then finally, the third, the one that we're really focusing on, especially during this meeting and the annual meeting coming in October, is human capital. What we're finding is that many, many, many countries are not prepared to compete in what will surely be a more digitally demanding economy in the future. And in order to get to each of those, growth and resilience and human capital, we've had to innovate. We've had to think of all new ways of raising the kind of capital that we needed. In 1960, 70% of all of financial flows to developing countries was in the form of official development assistance. Last year, it was about 8%. So official development assistance now is tiny compared to the overall capital flows. And so in order for us to be effective and in order for us to be relevant, we've had to think of many, many different ways. Just yesterday, we for the first time took IDA, our fund, the capital that sits in IDA, and we went to the capital markets. And we were very happy to find that the capital markets were extremely interested in purchasing our bonds, and so the price was actually very, very low. The bond spreads were very low. And we also know that we have to work to crowd in private capital. There's still $8 trillion in the world sitting in negative interest rate bonds. And so if we could mobilize some of that capital and use that to invest in, say, infrastructure in developing countries, we'll get so much more bang for the official development assistance bucks that exist. You know, for protecting the world from pandemics and from you know, problems like refugees, we've had to also be innovative. So we finally, for the first time, and you're because of your interest, you like this, we asked the question, so why is it that whenever a pandemic starts, we have to wait until some country decides to be generous and finance it? Why couldn't we insure the world against pandemics? And it had never been done before, but as of last year, I actually did the bond pricing call for our first ever in the world pandemic insurance bond. And we now have insured the 75 poorest countries against epidemics. So the Ebola crisis would not happen today because the money would be released much, much earlier to fight it. And it's a very straightforward 3-year capital at risk bond. And again, we weren't sure that the markets would be interested in it, but that too was twice oversubscribed because we paid 8.7% on average over a 3-year period, and people were so desperate for return that they were willing to risk losing all the capital because it is capital at risk. So we continue to do that. The next thing we're working on now is famine insurance. We asked the same question: why is it that we always wait till it's so late in a famine? Because usually famines aren't declared by the UN until it gets to stage 5, which is the worst stage. And what we know is that if we intervened at stage 3, we would prevent a lot of the terrible outcomes, and we would actually turn famines around early on. And so we're now once again talking with Swiss Re and Munich Re, who didn't believe we could do pandemic insurance, but when we did it, they got really excited about it. And so now we're talking with them, and I think we're going to be able to insure the poorest countries against famines in the not too distant future. So, you know, the disrupted world, it means that we too have to be as innovative as possible and bring our own disruptions to the table.
You've said so much here, there's so many questions that I think we all have here, and I want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions, but just a very specific one. On this last point, who triggers the announcement of a famine, or is that the World Food Organization? And by the way, would it include famines that result from political disruptions, such as Yemen?
So most of the famines in the last 20 years have been the result of some kind of conflict, right? But what we found is that it's still possible to intervene early. We could have intervened, if we had intervened earlier in Yemen, we would have been much, much better off. Again, we intervened too late. And what happens is that it's the UN that declares the different stages of famine. For pandemics, what we had to do is to bring disease modelers, infectious disease doctors, and the insurance companies together in one room. And they hardly ever sit in one room together. So when we did that, they came up with the annual incidence, the annual potential of an epidemic or a pandemic in any given year, plus they came up with the triggers that would get the money released. And it was a difficult negotiation, but now that we have it, we've got it. And so for 8.7% of the overall pot of money, which is about $450 million, instead of waiting and not knowing what's going to happen and then end up spending many billions of dollars as we do with Ebola, for 8.7% of the 450 million, every year we're insured, especially in the poorest countries, against that problem. And so the same thing with famine. We'll have to get a bunch of people in a room together and decide, so when would it trigger, and how would it be utilized, who would receive it? And we didn't, before the pandemic, we didn't know if the world could come up with something like that. But now that we do, we're going to move forward.
Going back to, you earlier mentioned about the World Bank and its need to, that the capitalization for assistance in the world is coming not so much from the international organizations as much as it comes from the private sector today. But you've recently launched a program called Maximizing Finance for Development. And it's an initiative, and you call it billions to trillions.
Right.
Tell us how you expect that to happen and how much of that is going to be done through the capital that comes from governments versus the private sector.
Yeah. So, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals were incredibly ambitious. But what we're now seeing is that because everyone knows how everyone else lives, the Sustainable Development Goals are actually reflecting what people are going to want. They're going to want, you know, all of these things at the same time. And so if you look at the price tag, if you were to achieve all the Sustainable Development Goals over the next, you know, up until 2030, the annual price tag is $4 trillion a year. And all of official development assistance is about $140 billion. So if you rely on ODA is extremely important. The generosity of donors is extremely important. But if you rely on that, we will never get even close to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals at $4 trillion a year. And so what we're saying is, are there examples where projects are commercially viable and instead of providing governments with a loan for which they have to provide a sovereign guarantee and then pay back, is it possible to get the private sector to go in and actually do it? And so we have there's great examples. So the Queen Ali International Airport in Jordan, and any of you who've been to Amman know that that's a great airport. Originally, they came and they said, the government said, we'd like to take a loan and we will run the airport. And working against his own incentives, which is to give that loan, one of our employees said, actually, this is commercially viable. We should do this through the private sector. So instead of giving the government a loan, IFC, our private sector group, came in and made the first $250 million investment. At the end of the day, it was $1 billion airport, but financed purely on commercial terms. And then the vendor, the group that ran it, there were a bunch of groups that wanted to run the airport, but a French group won the bidding. And so over the last 9 years, without paying a single penny of debt repayment, without putting a single penny into the airport, they were going to pay for about half of it. Without putting a single penny into the airport, they've received over $1 billion because they own 54% of the airport and therefore get 54% of the proceeds. So instead of putting money in, they've been getting money out without having to put money in. So that's our best example. There are a bunch of examples like that. And the problem with the multilateral development bank system is that because that project was was commercially viable, it meant that it was easy to prepare. And normally what we would do is all compete to try to give a sovereign guaranteed loan for that, because that's how the incentives are aligned. That if you get your loan out the door for that project and don't pay attention to whether it was commercially viable, then we are arguing that we would be shortchanging that country. Right? So we're now working on the basis of what we call a cascade. The first question we ask is this project commercially viable? Because what we hear from private sector representatives all the time is, that was commercially viable, but you basically crowded us out. Because of course it's easier for them to take a loan. It's easier for them to take a loan. It doesn't mean it's going to be run better. It doesn't mean it's going to be more efficient, but it's easier for them just to take the loan than, for example, to make the policy changes to make it possible for the private sector to invest. So first question is it commercially viable? If it is, we have to agree on almost ethical terms that none of us will come in and provide a sovereign guaranteed loan. And then the next question is, well, if it's not immediately commercially viable, are there things we can do? For example, can the World Bank, the public sector part, work with the government to make the kind of policy changes to make it commercially viable? Or do we need guarantees, political risk insurance, credit enhancement, all the tools that we have? If we put those on the table, then will it become commercially viable? And then if it's not, then of course we'll look at loans or grants. But we're committed to doing that in every country in the world. And so we feel that the only chance we have to reach the Sustainable Development Goals is to bring in that money and to get people to feel more comfortable investing in the developing world. Because right now, I talk to the leaders of the great private equity firms, the great investment houses, and they think about Africa as just risk. It's all risk, right? As opposed to saying, well, Africa is very different from place to place, and even within specific countries. In order for us to be able to get, say, the asset allocators, the people who run sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, in order to get them to feel more comfortable, we have to take this approach where we get them to think about risk reward in a very different way. There's this whole world now that's talking about impact investing. And frankly, unfortunately, it's mostly talk. It's mostly talk because not much of it actually gets done. But if indeed we're moving in a direction where people are not just saying, risk-adjusted reward or risk-adjusted returns, and they're saying we're going to look at risk, reward, and impact, well, we can help with that. And we think that that's one of our most important priorities.
Dr. Hibby, I think you've said so much here that stimulates a lot of thinking here. If you're agreeable, we'll take in the few remaining minutes. We'll take
Absolutely,
a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, and I see the first hand back here, please identify yourself and please ask a question and keep it as short as possible so we can get as many in, please.
Of course.
And back over here. Next.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. We've been hearing a lot of what you just spoke of, these new public-private partnerships. But as we look at a world 10 or 20 years from now, are we looking at a world where more public assets are sold and developed and end up in private hands?
Well, I think from our perspective, we're trying to remain as agnostic as we can be about ownership. So, for example, the Vietnamese government about, it's over 20 years ago now, they realized that they were just bleeding money into many of their state-owned enterprises. And so they came to us and asked, well, what can we do differently? And we said, well, we don't want to give you ideology, but here's what you could do. You could sell a chunk of the state-owned enterprises to a private company. They'll bring their modern approaches to running a company like that. And you can decide how much of it you want to sell. You can always sell less than half of it if you want, but we think that'll help you. And it's even possible that instead of putting money into that company every year because they're losing, you might actually get not only taxes, but you might get some profit out of that company. And so that worked well enough early on that they did this with many of their companies, but they didn't want to call it privatization, so they called it equitization. Okay? And Australia has an interesting word for recycling of assets. There's lots of ways of talking about it. And for us, as a World Bank group, we're not doing this as advocates for any company or advocates for any private sector industry. We're doing it as advocates for poor people, for the people living in a particular country. And so we're trying to approach this from an evidence base. We're not ideologically calling for the private ownership of all assets. What we're calling for is how can you literally maximize finance for development in a way that will lead you to what our targets are, which is the end of extreme poverty and boosting the prosperity of the poorest 40%. What would it take to get us there? And so, just to give you an example, we knew that the energy system in Egypt would require private sector investment to get them to the level that they needed to get to. We couldn't do it with all public financing. And so we went in, and this was just a few years ago, and with the money that we provided to the government, they made a number of major changes in their policy structure, and the changes were important enough and significant enough that now an additional, I think the total amount is $3 or $4 billion, an additional $3 or $4 billion of private capital, and frankly, the private investors were not interested in going into Egypt in the energy sector before this, but we were able to make enough changes that now the private sector has invested, and it's meant greater access to energy and lower prices for the entire country. At the same time, they've gotten rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which we knew, especially in Egypt, were a huge part of their public expenditures, and regressive. In other words, they benefited the rich much more than they benefited the poor. So the idea is to make the policy changes necessary to bring in the private sector, but always with an eye on ensuring that everybody benefits. So that's how we approach it. That's how we approach it, and we are focused on being as evidence-based as possible. And it's not trying to move toward either more private or more public ownership. It's trying to create the most efficient system you can imagine, so that everybody has a job, or that everyone has access to education, everyone has access to energy. We're trying to be the neutral broker that sits in between the private and the public sector, but we're also the champion of the countries, but specifically the poor people of those countries. I think there's an important role for an organization like the World Bank that doesn't have a specific interest, but has to work between sectors to make a contribution.
And the next question was over here, and then we'll take one from this side, and that'll probably be all we'll get. Have time for.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and thank you for hosting this. Looking at the nations themselves, Mr. President, how do you think that what 2 or 3 things should they think about as they're starting to approach the World Bank and other international bodies before they're even in the formal application process, so they're more streamlining towards what you think is really the pathway forward for these sovereign nations to really gain back much of their sovereignty and be able to realize the benefits that they're going to put their money into?
Yeah.
And thank you very much.
Thanks for the we're at the World Bank Group now. We have a whole team of people who are now trying to understand better how, say, technology, artificial intelligence, how that's going to affect the economy of the future. And so one of the things that we're trying to think about is what are the investments that you could make that would be no regret? What are the things that if you invest in are going to be useful down the line? And the way I asked the question to my own team is, about 25, 30 years ago at the World Bank Group, we had a heated debate on whether we should invest in telephone poles in India. Right? And luckily, it was close, but luckily we decided not to invest in telephone poles in India because we thought there may be a future for this thing called cellular phone service. Now, I keep asking my own teams, are we doing the equivalent of investing in telephone poles in India with our portfolio? Have we future-proofed our portfolio? And we have to think about that, but the countries have to think about it even more, right? So, there are large middle-income countries, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, that have childhood stunting rates. Indonesia 37%, India 38%, Pakistan 45%. And childhood stunting, we've now just done very recent research. And childhood stunting means that you're either through malnutrition or lack of stimulation or being in a toxic environment, you have literally fewer neuronal connections. So you're shorter, and the way we measure stunting is very simple. We just look for children who are 2 standard deviations below the normal height for age. And so if you're a stunted child, we have the data that you have a much more difficult time learning in school, and you have a much more difficult time earning when you finish school. And so when you're a middle-income country and you have close to 40% of your children who very well may be unable to compete in the digital economy of the future, you've got a problem. And so we think that investing in human beings is one of the clearest no-regret investments you can make. And so we're going to, in October, we're going to launch a human capital ranking. Now, this is going to be wildly controversial because countries are going to see that they're ranked below their neighboring countries that they've always felt superior to, right? And it's going to cause local disruption. And I've already talked with Doug Peterson of S&P. That if this data is very good, it's better than the data right now on the quality of education, what children actually get in the schools, what they actually learn, plus what we know about health outcomes is so good now that we can actually show a very strong connection to economic growth. So if you do the analysis, you take learning adjusted years of schooling, because not every country provides the same kind of schooling. You add to it things like childhood stunting and adult survival, and then you do a regression on growth looking backwards. The top quartile of countries that have improved their human capital the most have grown 1.4% per year, 1.4% of GDP per year over 25 years, faster than the bottom 25% of human capital improvers. Among the strongest correlations to economic growth we've ever seen. So the reason I'm putting the ranking out there is we could write 1 million wonderful papers about how important health and education are, and every head of state and minister of finance would get up and wax poetic about how important health and education are. But right now, the system is that everyone is simply waiting. Congressman Colby, we were too successful in a sense. There's so much money now flowing for health and education that countries are simply waiting. And they're saying, I mean, we actually heard from a middle-income country, we said, why don't you pay for your vaccines now? And that country said to us, well, why should we? Because we know if we wait long enough, the donor countries will pay for it. Right? So we're in that situation where we've not done a good enough job showing that the relationship between human capital and growth is probably as strong as it could ever be. I mean, there are a number of countries that invested in human capital before the World Bank told them that they could afford to. And they're mostly the countries that have emerged from middle-income status and become high-income countries, the East Asian countries. Right.
I'm mindful of the schedule that we have here, but most importantly, mindful of your schedule. And I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to take other questions because we have a very limited time here. But we do appreciate, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody in the room and the Bretton Woods Committee for taking time to be with us here today.
Well, again, we're at the World Bank, we're extremely grateful for the support of the Bretton Woods Committee members. Many of you, including Congressman Colby, have advocated directly for us. And we don't know where we're going on capital yet, but we will on Saturday. And so we're all just keeping our fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure. Thanks. Oops. Please keep your seats while our next speaker comes up here. Yep, ready. Hey, how are you? Good to meet you. Thank you. Thank you. Please have a seat. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Washburn, for being with us here. Actually, this is the first time you and I have had an opportunity to meet, but I'm very familiar with the work that I did as chairman of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of Appropriations on OPIC and the great work that it does. So we're really delighted to have you here with us today. Ray Washburn is the president of OPIC and was appointed by President Trump. He comes from a background of business and investment in Dallas with a number of investments in the restaurant business and shopping centers and a lot of other kinds of investments like that. He's very active in the community and was, I should say, and probably still remains very active in the community in Dallas with a number of boards, and he serves on. I know a little bit about serving on those boards that take a lot of your time, but are really worthwhile for the community. And we're just delighted to have you with us here today to share your thoughts about OPIC. And I thought maybe as an opening question, I'd ask you about the legislation that you've been promoting on Capitol Hill, and I think you just testified on that just the other day. Is that right?
I did last Wednesday. I had testified from 10 to 12, and then went out and got on an airplane, went to Lima, Peru for the Summit of the Americas. So it was a busy day.
It's called the legislation. I'm very busy day, busy week for you, I should say. Is better utilization of investment leading to development. The BUILD Act, and you might just tell us a little bit about that and how you think that is, and what are the prospects of Congress acting?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here today. Is when I was appointed by the president a year ago, February, thank you. The OPIC had been zeroed out, and so when I was going through my confirmation hearing, the question kept coming out: why are you going to take over running an agency that's zeroed on the budget? And we had a bigger plan for it than I think the press was giving us credit for. But OPIC was looked at by this administration as being a national security tool for our national security belt, as well as something that foreign policy really needs to grab onto. When it was started in 1971, it was really recreating the Marshall Plan. And when we were pulling out Southeast Asia, they needed a way to do investments in countries that U.S. companies were hesitant to go back into. And so since that time, it's built up. We've made a profit for 40 years in a row. When I went up to Capitol Hill, I was like, last year we made $260 million in profit. And so, and the big but was it needs to be modernized. And that's what the BUILD Act is all about. Basically, OPIC historically could do three things. We provide political risk insurance. What that means is we can do coverage for companies to be expropriated or contract terms changed and things like that. Second was we could do structured deals. We could loan up to 75% of the debt of a particular project. And third, we could put 25% of the amount of into a private equity fund that would specialize in kind of sector-focused investments like agriculture and sub-Saharan Africa, things like that. But what we missed and where we couldn't participate in the world economy was we had no right to put any equity in the projects. And so other countries' DFIs didn't want to participate with us, and we were continually cut out of projects because there wasn't the right to put in both debt and equity in the projects. And the last was we didn't have the right to do feasibility studies. So, for example, when I was down in Lima, we kept hearing that the Caribbean, all the ports in places like Honduras and Guatemala are all undersized for today's economy. We kept hearing that, but we don't have any way of knowing if that's actually true or not. But we also didn't have currently have the ability to fund a feasibility study to see if that would be an appropriate place for us to spend some money. So this new bill will give us those two new things to do. So it's very important, as well as we're taking a portion out of USAID that'll open up a lot more markets for us. And so the whole agency will be renamed. OPIC goes away, so I no longer have to explain we're not OPEC, which I run into everywhere I go. And it'll be the United States, Trade and Development Agency. So,
You just mentioned something that I thought I should follow up on.
Sure.
You said you'll take a piece out of USAID.
yes, we're lifting out. Well, they have a development part of USAID, and that's really not their focus. And it's small. It's only about 30 people and a small amount of money, but it's something that we'll manage. We'll use their offices in other countries, which is a great tool for us because it enables USAID agents around the world to now have 6 or 7 products to sell rather than just one.
How does this all fit into the broader foreign policy objectives of the United States?
Well, the United States, each administration determines what OPIC's mission is, and this administration has asked us to focus a lot of our attention on the Western Hemisphere, which hadn't been focused on in a long, long time, like the Northern Triangle, Central America, the Caribbean islands, Colombia, Peru, and those areas. So we're spending a lot of time looking at these countries. As everyone here knows, China is spreading their tentacles throughout the world, and so they've got a couple $1 trillion in their fund. We're very small. We're currently $28 billion in size. With this new legislation, we'll have $60 billion in size. So even though it doubles our size compared to other countries, Japan's $168 billion. We're still very, very small, but as we found, everyone looks for America to lead, and we've got to be able to lead through modernization of our techniques and having the money.
What kind of response are you hearing on Capitol Hill to?
It's been very positive. My hearing was very positive on both sides. Both the Democrats and Republicans like the mission and like what we're doing.
How do you tell legislators or other policymakers how they should explain to the American people that this kind of involvement and engagement with the world is important, and to explain to them, how do you explain the benefits of this? I mean, I always dealt with that when I was a member of Congress, as people would say, we don't like that foreign assistance stuff.
Right.
How do you explain to them that?
Well, we're not foreign assistance in the sense
I understand.
that we're not aid.
Right.
And first thing I tell them is we made $268 million last year.
People
and we're
like
profit making. They like that, but what we explain to hesitant people, there are two negatives come up, is this corporate welfare, and you pick winners and losers. And first question we ask on any loan that comes to us is, why haven't you used a bank financing, just conventional financing? It's a first hurdle they have to get over. If you're in a country and you can finance a deal with, if General Electric comes to us with a deal in Mexico that they could finance at Citibank, we can't do it. If they come to us with a power plant they want to do in Afghanistan, not too many banks want to go to Afghanistan. So we go to places, we're kind of the lender of last resort. And so once we explain that, and we don't pick winners and losers, we pick anyone that can come in, our doors are open, and when we're in a country, we have 675 projects currently in 90 different countries. And so the variety of what we have, it's everything from feedlots in Ethiopia to LNG plants in Vietnam to in Peru. We're helping to fund a new port for their fishing industry. Now, why is that important to the U.S. government to be helping with those things? Well, one is it's a loan, it's not aid. Two is it supports those local economies. And the most important thing to us, to stable governments in other countries, is employment. And in Northern Triangle of Central America, the gang activity in the United States and all isn't really coming out of Mexico, it's coming out of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and those countries. Why? They have a high unemployment rate. And if we can help stand up businesses in those countries that can employ people, that's to our national interest.
Good. You recently did an op-ed, I think, in The Hill, one of the newspapers up on Capitol Hill, in which you said the real emerging market isn't necessarily a country or a particular region, but it's women.
Yes.
You want to elaborate on that?
Well, if you look, women-owned businesses worldwide are the fastest growing segment of the business. And why? Well, because women haven't had an opportunity in a lot of these economies, in India and in Africa and other places. And the primary cause is they haven't had access to capital. So what OPIC has done is we've launched a women's initiative, which we call 2X, and we've put $350 million in to launch it with. That'll catalyze $1 billion of investment. And we're doing things like fintech, enabling everyone, I don't care how poor the country is or how bad the living conditions, they all have a phone. It's just amazing everywhere you go. So if we can enable fintech they can have bank accounts and minimal amount of money on their phone, they're able to have independence in that way. Second is we're trying to help with Electrify Africa, to go in and help power villagers up, to give them electricity to start businesses. And third is a water initiative we have to help bring clean water to villages. I was recently in India and we financed a thing called Water Health, and what they've done is they've gone in the villages for not a lot of money. They can drill a well, provide clean water. That enables women who typically have to go from a village, walk miles down the road every day to get clean water to bring back for their families to cook with, to bathe with, to clean with and all. And that just takes their entire day. The freedom a woman gets by having fresh water right there in her community goes a long way to helping them gain independence. So the initiative we did in India, for only $25 million loan, okay, once again it was a loan, it's going to provide water when it's fully laid out for 100 million people. So and that's not a humanitarian, that's a humanitarian thing, but from a business perspective, that's good. It provides people with business, just all aspects.
Dr. Kim from the World Bank was on the stage just a few moments ago, and something you just said made me think of something he was saying about how in India we're fortunate, the World Bank, to not make the mistake of investing 25 years ago in putting telephone poles everywhere in India, but they said maybe there's something to this idea of cellular phones in the future. Speaking of energy, what do you see? Do you see building power lines as the future, or is there going to be is solar or other kinds of energy, small energy, going to be the future?
Right. We have a huge portfolio of renewables worldwide, from solar and wind and all. Another big aspect is LNG. You look at the islands in the Caribbean, the cost of electricity is the highest in the world in all these Caribbean islands. It takes a huge part of their GDP just to pay for energy because they're all running on diesel fuel. But if we can put LNG into these islands, that brings their cost of their economy way down. And so that's another area we're looking that we can immediately get into these, because a lot of these countries just can't, solar just doesn't work and wind just doesn't work. Economically, they just don't work, but LNG does.
Yeah, well, wind and solar, of course, you have to have storage to go with that. But
that's correct.
If it's acceptable to you, can we open this up
Absolutely.
for a few questions here? Let's take some questions. I'll take the first hand I saw here. And we'll wait for the microphone, and please identify yourself and ask your question.
Mike Boyle, Boyle Energy, New Hampshire. Mr. Washburn, how does your organization flourish and thrive at this time under the Trump administration while the Ex-Im Bank is languishing in obscurity for the last 3 years?
Well, Ex-Im is a domestic-focused organization. What we are, we're 100% international. I can't do anything within the borders of the United States, any of our territories, Puerto Rico, and things like that. So why are we flourishing? There's such a demand worldwide for what we have, and we're really a tool of national security, and I think the people on the Hill realize that.
Other questions in the audience? Okay, we'll.
Covered everything.
I guess, no, we'll
Yeah.
come back to a couple of other things.
Yeah.
And I did want to ask you about you mentioned Power Africa initiative, and how is this helping to close the gap and make it possible for more American businesses to invest? Do you see investment in Africa as something of the future, large? It's been kind of a black hole for a while.
Yeah, well, we've got, surprisingly, countries like Nigeria and different ones that you wouldn't typically think of as a place that's active, or Zimbabwe or Botswana and countries like that. There is a huge amount, but they have no power, they have no communication. So we also fund cell phone towers to help get communication out of them. Once someone can get on the internet, it totally changes the economy.
It changes everything in their lives. It changes
absolutely
their
does.
lives. And
But that only works if they have electricity.
that's right. They have to have some kind of electricity. I see a question over here. Yes, ma'am. Wait for the.
Lyra Hughes Hale with Hale Global Economics. My question is, how does what you're doing compare to China's Belt and Road Initiative? How does it compare in scope? What about the lending? There's concern that the Belt and Road, that the lending might be something that can't be repaid. And the country focus, how would you compare your activities to that? How does the U.S. stack up?
Sure, great question. And Belt and Road is something that we have studied very closely. I've recently signed a MOU with both the Japanese government and a separate one with the Australian government, and we're about to do one with the government in India to co-invest together along the Belt and Road initiative. And that could be primarily ports, all types of infrastructure. The Chinese is an example of what you just asked in Sri Lanka. You probably know they've invested billions of dollars into a port. They overlent on it. Everyone knew it wasn't going to work. It didn't work. So what did they do? They foreclosed it. Now they control it for the next 99 years. But the Chinese have $2 trillion they're putting out throughout those areas. But as far as the shipping lanes go, and the India, I can speak to that because I just got back from there, is they're fearful of the Chinese controlling the Indian Ocean below their country and the shipping lanes. And so they'd like us to come and help finance the upgrade of their ports as a specific example. But we run into the Chinese everywhere, from Mexico to Peru. I mean, it's all over. So with just a small little $60 billion agency, we have to be very strategic about what we do and try to stretch our dollars out with joint ventures with some of these other countries. And so, yes.
Let's take the woman back there and then the other person there. Right there. Yes, ma'am.
Sure. Hello, thank you for your chat. I'm Courtney Vaughn, independent consultant. So my question is what relationship is there between World Bank and OPIC? For example, we know that World Bank has a major knowledge base on countries that they're supporting, and you had mentioned earlier that you didn't have the feasibility capacity per se inside OPIC, and there's a lot of knowledge in the World Bank. And I'm speaking specifically to a country like Nigeria that has a large infrastructure gap, especially in electricity. And my observation is that even with the Chinese engagement, there is a lot of money going into dinosaur technology, right? Dinosaur mechanisms, equipment, etc. And if one is looking future, and listen to what the World Bank president said earlier, where one is looking at a digitized world, you know, and even the US seems like, we know you're not going to get off the grid tomorrow, but the bottom line is a country that has a lot of gen sets, they're already used to distributive power per se, right? How do you collaborate to at least, not just to put money in the system, but to say, can this be sustainable, you know, if we look at it a different way with support of the World Bank, institutions like the World Bank?
Well, we work other DFIs around the world, the World Bank, the IFC, you know, IDB, all of them, we coordinate with all the time. I mean, our staff is always talking to, but you have to look at us really as a bank. And so somewhere like Nigeria, someone has to come to us with a project. Or if the World Bank says, or if we did a feasibility study, so we need to redo the electrical grid in Nigeria, you still have to find a private developer to come along, because the maximum I can put into a project is 75%. So someone's got to come up with that 25% or larger equity slug for a project. So, but we do work with the World Bank on coming up with ideas and places where we need to go. I'm open currently in 130 countries. We're active in 90 of them with active projects. So, but again, I have a small staff. I have about 300 people, and so the incoming projects, you know, we have to prioritize them in that way. So.
The statement you made, and then she also referred to it, that you don't do feasibility studies. Who do you rely on for your feasibility studies?
Well, the person that comes in the project. So, like, for example, when I was in Peru.
Putting up the 25% private?
No. Well, for example, we had several port deals come to us in the Caribbean. Do we really know, is there really demand? I mean, for what? I mean, it sounds right. You know, their little one-page brief paper sounds good, but we need the right to go in and fund feasibility studies in certain areas where there looks like there's a strategic need and find out really if there is one. For example, the Caribbean islands on LNG, we've done enough there that we know there's a big demand there. But if LNG was a new product and we didn't know what it could do, I don't have any ability to do that other than someone would bring us a project, and once they've applied, they start spending the money on a feasibility study. And a lot of companies don't want to throw money down a feasibility study until they know there's actual demand.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, sir. Right there in the middle.
Thank you, Jim. William Riley, World Wildlife Fund. I have invested with OPIC money in water in developing countries. Mm-hmm. Drip irrigation in India was a very successful one. Making money from the villages, however, is hard to do, and I'd be interested in the structure of that investment. Did you do it through a private equity firm? Did you make direct equity investments yourself in village wells and things of that sort? How did it work, and what were the expectations on return?
You're talking about water health?
Water health, yes.
Okay. They came to us, and a lot of those, I don't remember the exact, how much debt we did put onto that off the top of my head, but there are a lot of philanthropies that now will come in, and they'll do first loss money. So in that case, we had a foundation, I think it might have been the Gates Foundation, but one of the foundations came in. They put up money. They realized, let's say it was a $100 million project, and we put in 50. The other 50 might be dicey whether they're ever going to get their money back, right? Because it doesn't. But the 50 million piece would, which is the first debt. A lot of foundations will come in and put up that gap money just because they see that it's a good need to have. I don't have the specifics, but I'm happy to get you that information if you're interested in that. Yeah. And the other thing OPIC can do is our debt financing is at basically 10-year treasury, so it's not expensive. And a lot of these developing countries, you can only get 1 to 3 year debt because banks are scared of them and everybody. OPIC can give 20 and 30-year notes. And so in a water project that might take 5 to 10 years to develop out anyway, you got to have the opportunity to have long-term debt. And that's, when people say about corporate welfare, we're going to places you just can't get debt financing at all.
Yes, sir. And then I'll take one over here.
Thank you very much. First of all, my congratulations on having such a dynamic focus on international investing and promotion of American investment abroad, because when one looks at the policy formulations coming from Washington, normally one doesn't expect that. So I'm delighted to hear that the agency is doing such a great job. My question to you is, how does the selection of criteria, selection of projects reflect the views of U.S. government with respect to the countries involved? Do you have any country selection criteria like MCC does, for example, or do you just take any project that comes along where there's a U.S. interest?
Good question. We, we look at everything. So in those countries I said we're open, anyone who wants to call, we're happy to look at it. As far as taking our team, and we're basically drill down focus on three main areas right now. One is the Northern Triangle, other is the Belt and Road Initiative, and the other is Middle East. And so Afghanistan, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, some of those, trying to lean up some projects there. Africa we're still very active in. South America we're very, very active in. So we're not self-selected from that standpoint, but we just have so much manpower to go around and focus in on certain countries. We're closed in high-income countries. Another thing is we have a $15,000 GDP cap. So Peru, for example, is about $12,000 GDP. The Ukraine is $2,500 GDP. It's almost lower than every country in Africa.
Ukraine?
Yeah, I think they have a big black market, but that's what they tell us. So but it's about 2,500. So a lot of these countries, so we're closed obviously in high-income European countries and others, but we're open every country in Africa. We're open in every country in South America, but Bolivia and Venezuela, and Cuba. And I'll just throw in North Korea, Russia, and China. So other than that, we're open everywhere. So
There was a question over here. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Gary Kleiman. I'm an emerging financial markets expert. We've been talking about the unified DFI for a lot of years, and it looks like it's close to fruition. And with OPIC, always the reservation had been whether you would have the power to take equity stakes, and it seems like you'll be able to do that. And I wonder, just in terms of the comparative advantage and capacity you see going forward, I mean, do you see that making a huge difference, or other elements like the MCC, which was just mentioned, is now allowed to do regional compacts? I mean, what do you see sort of being your major drivers, let's say in the near term, with this new power?
well, first we got to get it voted on and passed. So, but once we get that, a little thing on the legislation, I've done my House, and I'll be going up in front of the Senate Foreign Relations sometime in May, and then our goal is to have it voted on by, well, I shouldn't say that because the Senate determines all goals, but we'd like to get it done by the summer recess. And if we're not able to do that, it might be year end. But the two sponsors of the bill, on the House side, Royce, and on the Senate side, which is Corker and Coons, Corker's leaving and Royce is leaving. And to both of them, this has been a big legacy item. It's been working, as many of you in this room know, for years and years and years. We finally have got to the point that we think we can get it over the goal line, that legislation's been introduced. The White House supports it. At my hearing the other day, I had both the White House send a letter of support, as well as Elizabeth Littlefield, who was my predecessor under the Obama administration. We got incredible bipartisan support. If it's ever going to happen, this is the year we think it's going to happen, especially with two sponsors leaving, January 1st, getting it pushed through.
That does give them an incentive to try
Yeah,
to
it
get
gives
it
them
done,
great incentive. And to them, it's a great achievement and win to have going out. As far as what it does for us on the equity side is we get cut out of an incredible amount of deals because the other countries don't want us in. And the reason is we've always taken senior debt. So if we go into a project, other countries are always, unless they go in on our debt stack where we can go pari passu with them the debt, if they ever put equity in, they're always behind the U.S. And in 2008, 2009, when all the markets melted down, a lot of those countries got totally wiped out in their investments in steel. OPIC did just fine. But countries are now saying, we don't want you involved because we don't want you to have a senior position to us. So we've got to have that. Now, that doesn't mean our debt can still be senior. We got to have some equity at risk on the risk side so they know in their minds we have skin in the game.
We have time for at least one more question here. I'll take this down right there.
Bill Salter from Citigroup. You mentioned that you have a small budget compared to, or fund compared to China, et cetera. What would be your ideal budget?
My ideal size, well, I don't know. Sometimes having just a ton of money has you do dumb things. I think the Chinese are throwing money away on a lot of projects. They're way over financing them. They're doing things that shouldn't be done to begin with, trying to buy influence.
Are they succeeding in buying influence?
The Chinese?
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. A lot of these countries. I mean, every country I go to, they have a brand new soccer stadium, courtesy of the Chinese. I mean, it's amazing. The airport, I was in Zambia. You land at the airport, being built by a Chinese construction company. Get in the bus, first thing you see coming out of the airport, soccer stadium given by the Chinese. They're buying all the rare earths and minerals in these countries. So I don't think you could ever have enough money. You could have trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. We're just trying to do what we have, and I think $60 billion, ideally probably be closer to 100, but, currently we only have 22 billion deployed. I've got 7 billion more to, OPIC typically has done 3.5 to 4 billion a year. This equity authority is going to give us the ability to do a lot more real quick, but it's still going to take several years to even get up to our cap, doing the right projects. And doing the right projects is having developers coming in, sponsors, and continuing to put in a substantial amount of equity with us. Because by doing that, the failure rate since 1971 at OPIC is 1%. And the reason is there's so much equity in these deals, and we can give long loan terms. Things typically work their way out, even if you go through a recession, because the loan terms are, aren't this 3-year bullet that a lot of people have been facing.
Well, that leads me to the final question, because I know you've got a hard stop here, but at the outset, you mentioned the 3 things that OPIC did traditionally. Are you still doing political risk management?
Yeah, I tell you what's interesting on the political risk insurance. As I said earlier on the structured side, if a bank can do the deal, that's the first question we have to ask. Political risk insurance, OPIC used to do about $9 billion. We're about $3.5 billion today. The reason is the private market has woken up to you can make money in the political risk insurance world. That's good. That has reduced our book by 2/3, and I'd rather it be zero. I'd rather OPIC not even exist, but that's not the reality of the world we live in. And so it's shrunk just because the private market has come in. And so on that political risk, that's another question we ask. Will the private market provide that insurance first?
As I recall from my time in Congress, that was a moneymaker for OPIC.
It still is.
Still is.
Yeah, it still is very much a moneymaker, but I'm glad private industry has started because they, in fact, there's our biggest competitor are former OPIC employees that went out and started a competing political risk insurance company, which is great. Because again, we want private enterprise to do it, not government, but we kind of fit that gap where private business won't go.
Well, President Washburn, thank you so much for coming and visiting with us here today, and I think you've given us some really good insights into the direction of OPIC, and we're very pleased to have you with us.
And if we get this additional funding, we're looking for deals. So you guys bring us some projects. So,
thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, sir. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Please keep your seats. We're going to restructure this for the next panel here, but thank you very much, President Washburn, for being with us here.
Very. I'm part of the restructuring. You see a very intriguing title for what I'm about to talk about. Bretton Woods at 75. Yes. A year from now, next April, will mark the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And in view of where we are today, where the whole world is today, it would be particularly timing, we think, to recognize and to celebrate and to learn from what that means, the history of the Bretton Woods Conference means to the world from so many years ago in New Hampshire. In my view, the conference was a radical game changer for the world, The century prior to 1944 was pretty bad. for everyone. Two major global wars. Sandwiched between them was the deep, deep global recession. Global, resulting altogether with the loss of millions of people killed and suffering. The leaders that met at Bretton Woods toward the end of that war decided basically that enough was enough. The future had to be based on peaceful cooperation, international cooperation, for the benefit of all people, and not just for the current victors, the winners of the last World War. That was a very different view of the world compared to what had existed before. Since then, basically, the Bretton Woods system over all those years has worked pretty well. There were some bumps in the road. For example, during the Nixon administration in the 70s, the international currency regime was basically changed, thrown away, actually, by floating the dollar on the part of the U.S. And in response to any criticism that the U.S. received for that, the way it was handled particularly, our Secretary of the Treasury, then serving, said, yeah, it's our dollar, but it's your problem. That was a kind of a departure from the Bretton Woods outlook and mission. But it had a direct and rather drastic impact on the workings of the IMF, as well as on the bank, although less so. And some said, in Congress and in public and in the press, really now is there any need with the Smithsonian behind us for any Bretton Woods institutions, the fund or the bank? And there was a discussion about it. But in the 70s, and this is not unrelated, there also saw the emergence of the Petrodollar Crisis, a very serious development, which followed and actually was a cause of the Latin American debt crisis, both of which lasted well into the 1980s. It became clear to many at that point that the Bretton Woods approach of international cooperation continued to be crucial to dealing with these kinds of problems. And as another Secretary of the Treasury said at that part, Joe Fowler, if we didn't have the fund and the bank today, we would have to invent them. This was in the early 80s. And Joe, after he retired as secretary, got together a group of leaders, former government officials and financial types, and formed this committee, the Bretton Woods Committee, in 1983, as a constituency, an American constituency, in support of the Bretton Woods, not only the institutions, but the whole concept of the system, which had developed since 1944. The committee attracted a pretty strong membership, strong leadership. One of those was Paul Volcker, who was co-chair of this committee for several years. And the membership has always been very active and involved in support. By 1994, the 50th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference was celebrated. And I see there are a few people here who were there then. And that was only 25 years ago. And the result of that was a book, this one. Some of you have seen it, I'm sure. It's no longer available on Amazon. The demand far exceeded the supply was less than the demand. But it was a very popular thing at the time, and the recommendations in it met with great interest, acclamation, but not so much implementation. In fact, some of those recommendations we could maybe take up again next year in the 75th anniversary. However, it was under the leadership of Paul, and by that time, what had started, the committee had started as a domestic U.S. constituency. It had evolved into an international organization with a global breadth. Since then, 25 years ago, the Bretton Woods institution and institutions and the system have been very much in demand. They've been very active. And since 1954, actually, the Bretton Woods system, and that's the way it's been characterized as the system, has grown in many ways that were not envisaged at the time of the original meeting in 1944, for example, with the development of IDA, of MEGA, the regional multilateral development banks that covered the world, and related financial agencies such as the BIS and the Financial Stability Board. It's all part of, they all work together toward the same objectives. And as Paul Volcker stated, actually this was at our last year or the year before meeting of this committee. I like this little statement he made. After all, Bretton Woods is not a particular institution. It's an idea, a symbol of the never-ending need for sovereign nations to work together to support open markets in goods, in services, and in finance, all in the interest of a stable, growing, and peaceful world economy. And so with this background, and as we look at where we are today, which is quite a look, and what the future may bring, we thought it'd be very timely to marshal the wisdom and experience, expertise of both within this committee and across the lines of the committee to look again at and assess the role and priorities of the Bretton Woods system. So now we're beginning to process, this is just beginning, what we're calling it the Bretton Woods at 75 initiative, forward-looking effort to strengthen and support the Bretton Woods in the future. There are, the goals are pretty clear, but they're very broad, and that is to encourage current and future leaders to recommit to the spirit of Bretton Woods and the values of international economic cooperation as a force for global peace and prosperity. We just started this. We've asked quite a few distinguished people to contribute some way. We thought maybe writing essays on areas in which they're interested. And it turns out, as so far, we got quite a group of actually mostly central bankers and both current and former central bankers and finance ministers, including Mark Carney, Bill Dudley, Jean-Claude Trichet, Axel Weber, Arminio Fraga, Mohamed Al-Jasser, Toyo Guillotin, Tarman Shanmugaratan, Mohamed Al-Arian, and of course Paul Volcker and of course, Jim Wolfenson. They've all signed up, and many others have been invited. Our immediate aim is to have a compendium of essays by people like that, many more people like that, and followed by the celebration of some kind next year in April when we meet again. We want very much to have our committee members involved in this process, and we can't go much further than this at this point, but we do want to keep in touch with you and want you to be in touch with us to give us ideas and direction in which way to go. I think it should be very constructive, and hopefully it will have an impact. I can't ask for questions at this point, but we, all of us on the committee level, will be very anxious to hear from you and to have you engaged in the process if you think it's a good idea. And I ask you this question: do you think it's a good idea? Say something. Yes. Okay. Does anyone not think it's a good idea? No need to talk. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I'll introduce our next segment, which will be headed up by Bill Rhodes, our advisory council member, and known to all of us. He's got a great broad experience, and as you know, he is known as, particularly to himself, as banker for the world. Bill, why don't you come up here, get our panel together, and introduce them. Bill? And the panel, please. Are we all here? Good. Thank you.
They were all waiting in the wings.
They're there, good.
You're there. Yeah. And yeah, just take Luis Alberto.
How are you? Hi, how are you?
Thank
you very much.
I'm going to start up here. Thank you, Dick, for giving us a history of the Bretton Woods system and mentioning the very important compendium that we're putting together. I was involved in one for 50 and one for 70 years, but I think this one is going to be, as Dick indicated, very special. We have a great panel. We don't have a lot of time because I know there'll be a lot of questions. First of all, we have David Lipton, who everyone knows here is the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and I thank you for hosting us here, David, today. Claire Woodman, who's been with us before, who's the Global Chief Operating Officer of Morgan Stanley International. From London, our good friend, Luis Alberto Moreno, who's been so helpful to us over the years, and Dr. Joachim Van Ansberg, who is the Vice President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is starting to play a very important role in Asia. And since we had discussions on the One Belt, One Road, I'm sure we'll hear something from him in that regard. I think when we take a look at the world today, we're looking at economic conditions that look much brighter than we've seen in the past, and we just saw the IMF recent report underlining that. But in saying that, we still face a lot of problems, such as looming trade wars, rising debt levels, rising geopolitical tensions. All we have to do is mention Middle East, Korea as an example, a vast infrastructure gap, and potential for regulatory race to the bottom. We'll be hearing more about regulation with our last speaker today. I guess against this backdrop, what we want to hear from our panel is how countries can capitalize on the momentum of the improving economy while navigating global and regional risks. I think we have to remember it was only 9 years ago when we had this conference that we were talking about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So it's taken a long time, but we certainly have come a long way. But we can't take this growth for granted, and we always have the possible downsides, slowdowns. We're 9 years into basically coming back from the Great Recession. And so this is a very important, I think, moment for us. I have a general question for everyone to start off with, and depending on time, I go back to everybody. But I think the question is how we should be, and I'd ask each of our panelists to start off with that, and then I'll go back to, for individual questions, how they view this particular scenario that I've outlined in their areas, and for that matter, worldwide as you see it. And we'll start with you, David.
Thank you, Bill. First, let me say thank you to the Bretton Woods Committee for having this event and for inviting me here. It's been great over the years to have the Bretton Woods Committee so strongly supporting our institutions. Listening to the talk about Bretton Woods 75, I realized I first worked at the IMF in 1981, so I've been one way or another working on IMF issues for more than half of the 70-plus years and seen a lot of what's happened here, and also the long-standing support from all of you. I think it's a good moment in the global economy. As we like to say, the sun is shining. Our message this week to people is that it's a good time to fix the roof while the sun is shining. You know, since I came back to the fund in 2011, year in, year out, we found that our forecasts, our previous forecasts had to be downgraded, a sequence of basically bad news surprises. But the last 3 times before this one, we've been upgrading our forecasts. So the metric of our errors is basically the direction of news, of unexpected results. And I think we've seen strengthening of the global economy, broadening of the global economy, and in particular, finally, and of interest to all of you, trade growing more rapidly than GDP after many years where that was not the case. And I think that's because investment is strengthening, and investment involves a lot of importation. You know, I think this is not just advanced economies recovering, but also broadly across emerging market countries. There are a range of different circumstances, obviously, and some of the commodity exporting countries are still adjusting to the fact that what they had presumed about commodity prices and their incomes was turned out to be too high. But I think we're in a good period, and for reasons we can go into as we go along, I think the future may not be quite as good as today, so it's a good time to fix the roof.
Luis Alberto.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here to the Bretton Woods Committee, and of course, David and you, Bill, have devoted a lot of your time to fixing the roof in Latin America when it was truly leaking. But today, well, of course, we're in a very different moment. As you know very well, I think the whole macroeconomic situation that, as David was correctly saying, helps all ships rise. And what that means in terms of our work in Latin America is really moving ahead on many of the structural reforms that are needed. We went from having almost 7 countries in recession to having only 1 now, which is the case of Venezuela, a country you know well, Bill. But at the same time, our biggest challenge, and to follow on something David was saying, is where do you get more growth? And that, to me, is the larger question that we have in Latin America. And to get more growth, clearly, the answer lies partly in productivity. And behind that is a whole set of structural reforms that are still pending. Reforms associated with how we invest in human capital, the kind of quality of how we do our investment, how we manage our savings rate and how we increase it, but equally how we diversify our export base. We continue to be largely like we were 20 years ago, exporting fundamentally 5 or 8 commodities, of which, of course, Latin America still has a very large market share. But we got to learn a lot from countries like Canada and countries like Australia and others who were able to, around some basic commodities, develop, especially into the services area. And this is, of course, the big challenge today for Latin America. Growth still is below what it should be. This year, according to the latest numbers, it's going to be close to 2%, probably closer to 3% next year. But there's still a lot of shocks that are possible in the horizon, like you were mentioning, especially what happens with the interest rates in the United States and other countries. But at the same time, before, as you know, in the days you spent time in Latin America, most of our shocks came through the financial channel or our trade channel. The larger shocks for the future are going to be associated with the intolerance around issues like corruption, which I think is the huge issue today in Latin America. I just came back from the Summit of the Americas, where both the private sector and governments were very much focused on what to do around the issues of corruption. And then, even though we have inequality, have always had inequality, the patience for people to have inequality of opportunity is a very big issue. And I think that requires a very different kind of mobilization in our society. So these are more of the challenges that I see going forward.
I think your comment on corruption is well taken at this point. I know the IMF is talking about a program there, the World Bank is, and I think it's becoming more and more of a concern. Let me turn to Claire, and then we'll move on to Joaquin, and then I'll go back to you with specific questions. Claire?
Well, thank you for letting me in, because I've never worked for the IMF, and I seem to have managed to get on a panel 2 years running, so thank you. I work for a US global bank with a very cross-border business, so we like to think of ourselves as being there as an intermediary to help repair the roof. Yes, very much consensus around economic growth and positive conditions. Clients and investor sentiment is extremely positive around the global economy, corporate earnings. We've seen, rising equity markets since 2009, and client sentiment is that that's broadly continuing. And hence you've seen, the large US banks all report first quarter earnings, and you've really seen a part of what's driven those results has been real client activity that the banks have facilitated. So what's on the client's mind at this stage, Bill, is scanning the horizon. The big debate that we're having with clients and investors is how long has the business cycle got to run? What are the potential risks out there that might emerge, and where are the sources of those risks? And you raised trade tensions. Is the concern that trade tensions escalates to something that basically becomes an impediment or a barrier to the free flow of capital and goods and services? Our economists' view is that this is manageable, and this is really, the end game is really a process of negotiation, and this, really de-escalates. The second concern is which, clients find hard to quantify, and the markets respond very quickly to, is geopolitical tensions, and you saw the markets react very quickly recently with respect to Syria and North Korea. But more pointedly, our economists, and we put a piece out yesterday, was really the focus, and I think this has come out through the IMF's work, is around financial stability risks as potential sources that just might cause, this extension of the business cycle to contract at some point in the future. The IMF and the Federal Reserve and Basel have done extensive research on this, but there's certainly indicators around leverage, etc., excessive leverage, the size of debt in the economy at the moment that really need to be watched for sources of risk. But, if we see, continued investment in technology and innovation, which really helps productivity, there may well be a positive and a bright side to this.
Thank you. Joaquin?
Thank you for having me here. You asked what can countries do to benefit from the advantageous situation. In a word, I would say invest. What can they do to protect themselves from the risks? In 2 words, I would say invest well. So let me drill down a little bit into both aspects. Invest because our member countries, and these are primarily the Asian emerging and developing markets, face a unique opportunity of ample available capital at low cost, still low costs. That is quite unique if you look historically, and incredible investment opportunities at good returns. So if you look at the big regional trends from urbanization to infrastructure gaps, yes, infrastructure gaps are a hindrance to growth, but they're also an investment opportunity and mean that there's plenty of projects that can be invested in at good and high returns. If you look at trade, while parts of the region are well integrated, there's huge opportunity for expanding trade, for example, between South and East Asia, just to give one dimension of sort of growth opportunities. And if you even look at potential challenges, climate change, technological change, all those present investment opportunities. So in sum, the combination of ample available capital and investment opportunities creates a big opportunity to invest. Now, we work in infrastructure, and we see the paradox or the puzzle that despite capital available and capital needed, very little actually flows into emerging country infrastructure. And that then leads to the policy agenda for improving regulatory environment, improving project preparation, and improving the structuring of infrastructure projects for institutional investors, and an agenda that the multilaterals have been working on for years and I think are making good progress. And we were set up to actually help move that agenda forward together with our peers. So the prospects in the region, I think, are bright unless something goes wrong. And of course, things do go wrong. And so what can go wrong, and how do countries prepare themselves for that? Debt could go wrong. Ample availability of capital means there's always the risk of excessive debt. This is where I said invest well. The answer to that is careful scrutiny of projects. We are a bank, so we have very strict criteria for the projects we invest in, because it is ultimately the return to those debt finance investments that will determine whether debt leads to disturbance or leads to growth. So that's one dimension of risks. Social tension, of course, but again here, the right policies are those that maintain growth and ensure broad-based benefits from growth. Poor policies could derail the scenario. Of course, we're looking at a region that's half the world, so there's a whole range of different policy choices that could go wrong. But overall, I think in the region, there's a pretty strong consensus across the political spectrum on sound economic policies. So overall, I think we are very optimistic about development in the region, and yet encourage our member countries to, as others said, fix the roof and make sure they're prepared for disturbance that could come from anywhere in the world.
Thank you. I know, David, you and the managing director have talked quite a bit recently about your concerns on what's going on with the trade tensions in the world. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, something which you're an expert on. We first met, how many years ago? 30 years ago, working on East and Central Europe when you were helping turn around Poland and the debt problems there. The growing indebtedness we see in the world. I mean, I can just think of China, and you might want to comment first on the trade tensions, which I think are really concerning the world markets and the potential, unfortunate potential there, and maybe that you might want to get into the indebtedness area.
You know, I started out with the baseline, and the baseline is good, but I think it's our job to think about what pushes us off the baseline. First, of course, we're in a cyclically a strong point, and countries are growing more rapidly than potential. And at some point, that's got to turn. But moreover, the policies that are right now have been driving recovery and sustaining recovery include a lot of monetary accommodation. And there's been a lot of liquidity, a lot of credit creation. On top of a lot of the sovereign debt that was incurred as part of the cleaning up of the global financial crisis. So debt is very high. We've been talking about the fact that global debt, public and private, is $164 trillion, roughly twice global GDP, and that's up about 40 percentage points since before the global financial crisis, and a large proportion of that increase, 40% of that, is from China. I think the monetary accommodation and loose financial conditions creates a climate in which that's going to continue rather than stop. So I think it's very important that countries, especially where there's high sovereign indebtedness, take policy steps gradually so that they don't hinder the recovery, to get debt trajectories going downward once again. That we, as an institution, help members individually, because they'll all be in different situations. Some can overcome this problem by adjustment. Some will need debt treatment. We are seeing, unfortunately, some low-income countries, especially the commodity exporters, whose circumstances, as I mentioned before, are worse now, falling again into debt difficulties. And we face the new challenge that their creditors are not necessarily the traditional Paris Club creditors. It may be a group of creditors that aren't accustomed to dealing with the problem of how the IMF goes forward when it needs financial assurances, and debt operations are part of that picture. So I think debt's one of the subjects that's important and could derail recovery for some. The other, of course, is trade. It would be very unfortunate for trade tensions to derail recovery. It would be very ironic since, right, as I mentioned, trade is helping drive recovery right now, and just in a moment where trade is a positive, for it to turn to a negative. We know trade has been an important part of the driver of global growth and of the catching up of low-income and developing countries for years, and it's important to protect that, and rather to be looking more for ways to increase market access rather than to put in place new impediments. Now, that said, I think it's fair and understandable that countries where there's been a lot of dislocation, and the U.S. is one, draw attention to some unfair trade practices around the world. And I think countries who've, whether it's been WTO legal or illegal, or inside the rules or outside the rules, countries that have had trade practices that really aren't fair, if they want globalization to endure, they should take a look at their own practices, and everyone needs to be contributing to a free and fair trade, greater market access rather than lesser. At the same time, the United States, I think, should not be trying to achieve its aims through the imposition of trade barriers, but rather through cooperative and internationally broad approaches to this. I think, for example, there's an awful lot of concern around the world about China's trade practices, and it is ironic if that's not spoken about, and that really should be part of trying to drive a good discussion and a good conclusion to the disagreements that exist right now.
How do you see the role of the IFFIs, but particularly the International Monetary Fund, in trying to advise countries in this area? Because the last thing we need is to get into a trade war reminiscent of Smoot-Hawley, et cetera. And the IMF, whenever there's a situation that's very difficult, people tend to look to the IMF to help in this area.
Well, we're trying to lead a discussion here, among the whole membership, to stress the point that there really are joint interests in globalization enduring. China has benefited from it. That's why China could never have accomplished what it has so far without deep interconnectedness, and won't continue to proceed without it. The rest of the developing world is counting on interconnectedness. With all of the new technologies and the need for, on the part of developing countries and emerging market countries, to have all of that technology disseminated to them, we need globalization to endure. So there's a two-sided interest in this. The advanced economies have been concerned about the dislocations that come from globalization and from technological change. We need for people in really across the world to believe that the whole system is free and fair, and so I think it's it's our job to try to bring people together behind a common vision of globalization in everyone's interest.
Thank you. Luis Alberto, you have worked very hard and done a lot in the area of infrastructure, and there's no area of the world, maybe Africa, that needs it more than Latin America. I mean, take the case of Brazil, so many countries. You might want to comment on that, but I can't let you go without asking you about the electoral process this year in Latin America, because you have elections for president in the two largest countries in Latin America, Brazil and Mexico, which will have a big impact not only on Latin America, but globally, and particularly when here we're struggling trying to get NAFTA done. And so maybe I've thrown you a lot there, but maybe if you could comment on some of that.
Well, first of all, on the infrastructure question, you're correct, Bill, in that we have to double the amount of investment that we do in infrastructure. There's simply no way to do that simply out of public spending. We've worked a lot, as Joaquin was mentioning, on the ways that we can do far more in the way of public-private partnerships. This is a big theme of Argentina in the G20, and the notion that you can move in the direction of having infrastructure as an asset class. But fundamentally, is how do you balance risks? And this is the biggest issue that you have, not only the regulatory risk, the financial risks associated with local currency, the way that you can mitigate some of those foreign exchange risks, and then some of the regulatory risk associated with PPPs. And we've made some good progress on this. I think, interestingly enough, and this is very much of a Bretton Woods kind of discussion, but when you look at our balance sheets, the reality is that we collectively as multilateral development banks do maybe about 4% of our total lending in the way of guarantees. And those guarantees help mobilize around 40% in terms of additional resources. And so the question is, how are we smarter in getting a guarantee mechanism such that we don't have to book them as loans, which is the case in our accounting, but rather as guarantees in a MIGA type structure, but taking it even deeper. And I think that's something that we all collectively have to think through. One of the things that we did at the IDB was to consolidate all of our private sector windows into one, put more capital, and today we're doing about $3 billion a year in lending, largely infrastructure, and mobilizing double that amount. So these are the kinds of things that we should think as development institutions, how we can become a platform to mobilize far more resources. In terms of the elections, it's impossible always to predict. Let me begin at the outset to say this. In the Summit of the Americas this past week, what I found was a very different Latin America, much more forward-looking. You know well that we love to look, spend all of our time thinking of what happened in the past. And that's what makes us so different from Asia, which they're always putting all the emphasis on the future. But here the agenda was around issues of corruption, issues of how do we deepen our own trade integration. Latin America only does about anywhere from 18 to 20% of our trade is within the region. What is missing? I think there's other elements. How do we do better, for instance, our integration in energy? It's not about building more dams or more renewable sources. It's how do you do interconnection better? And that has all to do how you share grids, things like that. How do you do things like passports of pension funds? We have $700 billion sitting in private pension funds in Latin America. So these are some of the challenges in terms of integration. I think that's the agenda going forward. Having said that, what I see in Brazil is more of a, it's still a long ways to go. It's in October, but that's probably not unlike what you had in December before your election. A lot of candidates out there, but I see perhaps a convergence towards the center, and I think this is a good thing. A lot of what I see happening in Brazil, as you know well, is that many of the issues that were not discussed in Brazil are discussed every day. Everybody talks about pension reform. I think that's the first step to begin to do a pension reform. Probably the traffic cannot bear it right now, but it's something that is going to be taken on. So I think that you will find that Mexico is harder to read, at least right now. The election is in July. In Colombia, for instance, for a while there, we thought we were going to have a very left of center candidate, and today it will be somebody who actually worked with me very closely and learned everything he learned at the IDB, a young guy, very good. So look, at the end, maybe because I'm Colombian, I'm optimistic, but I think I see the region moving in the right direction and with the kind of leadership that we need for this moment.
Thank you very much. Claire, we couldn't let you go without saying something on Brexit and how you see
that was going to happen.
and how you see London surviving, prospering as an international financial center with all of the give and take. I mean, you can't pick up a newspaper, particularly the Financial Times, any particular day when they don't talk about what are the possibilities or lack thereof of London continuing as a major international financial center.
Well, thank you for that one, Bill. Because I wish I had a lot of detail to actually talk about, but all I can talk about is kind of where we're at. And firstly, just a point about, and this is something that we talk a lot with clients and investors about transition. So there was an agreement between the UK and the EU about transition arrangements being in place broadly till December 2020. There is still a lot to do to actually legally finalise the transition and the withdrawal agreement. It's got to get finalised. There's some and this is an agreement not about what the nature of the trade arrangements and access will look like. This is actually just about what the Brexit process is about. And within that, there are some still very politically sensitive issues for the UK and Ireland. The Irish border question is not yet resolved. So what needs to happen? The agreement needs to be finalised and then it needs to be ratified. It will probably be relatively straightforward through the EU Parliament, but it's got to get through the UK Parliament yet, and there will be a very active discussion around it. So I think we're optimistic if we think that that agreement gets finalised by the autumn. The intention is that it gets ratified by the first quarter of 2019. That's about the process. It doesn't tell us anything about what we're transitioning to, and that's what businesses who are, based in London and have based their operations in London because London was a great gateway to Europe, that's what they need to know. They need to know what's the certainty of the access arrangements that they'll have to access EU markets, keeping their businesses in London. And so most firms have got their contingency plans in place. They're essentially to make sure that firms can continue to service EU clients and EU activity, and will largely mean that the regulated activity that you have to conduct in EU 27 will be substantially, they've got the resources there in place. But as I said, we still don't know what we're transitioning to. Yes, there's a lot of coverage in the news on this, but we're still short on actual detail about the access arrangements. What's key for very regulated businesses is not just the nature of the access arrangements, but the scope and extent of regulatory cooperation. So for financial services, the commitment of UK and EU regulators to cooperate and collaborate is absolutely key. I think they're very thoughtful, and we've had some positive signs on that, but that needs to go in conjunction with, a good open access arrangement. We'd sort of like the status quo, basically, Bill.
That I understand. Thank you very much. Joaquin, two questions I'd like to ask you. One, obviously, your institution is very much involved in infrastructure, and the One Belt, One Road, the Silk Road, is the largest single infrastructure project probably in world history. as we look at it today. The other thing is, in China, we've seen comments by President Xi Jinping and others in the leadership about opening up the financial system. And David commented on some of the practices where the Chinese have not wanted to open up before. And they seem now prepared to, particularly in the financial system and maybe elsewhere. Every day we pick up the paper and there's some announcement that they're going to open up more and you know, make better conditions in the automobile industry. But one of the real drivers here is going to be the financial system. And you've just had a realignment. For instance, in the People's Bank of China, Zhou Xiaochuan is gone. Yi Gang, who was his deputy, is there. You've had changes with Liu as a senior economic person. And then the friend of many of us here, Wang Qishan, is now the vice president of China. And all of these people have sort of mentorees of Zhu Rongji, who was a great liberalizer you know, in modern Chinese history. So I'm giving you a lot to answer here. And after that, we're going to open up for questions because this is such a great panel. And I don't want to be accused of not giving people the opportunity to question this great panel. Joaquin?
Thank you. Well, you mentioned three initiatives that are loosely tied together by China taking a bigger role on the global stage in the global economy. So one, the Belt and Road Initiative, two, the creation of AIB, the institution I work for, and then three, financial sector opening. Let me talk about each of those three briefly. I mean, Belt and Road is an initiative, as the title says, and I think it's very important to keep in mind that it's an initiative, which means it's more of a label and a slogan than a project or a program. It is certainly not an institution. And I think Belt and Road Initiative has gotten a lot of traction, particularly probably because at the same time as Belt and Road went on the road, there has been doubt from other countries about the benefits of openness in trade, and Belt and Road is very proactively promoting an open world that benefits from trade, just like China and other Asian countries have done for decades. So Belt and Road, I think, has become a motivator for countries to pursue investment plans, infrastructure in particular, but not only infrastructure. And it could become, if it is successful, a coordinator, in particular for investments that require cross-country coordination. Because many of these trade corridors do require very carefully coordinated investments among many countries, and that's where you need coordination. So in that sense, I think Belt and Road has become a very welcome initiative, particularly with the prospect of investments following. But of course, the fact that it's an initiative also means there are really no clear rules, and that I think is also part of why some quarters are worried about Belt and Road, because there are no particular rules or standards involved with it, because it is just an initiative. So one actually has to look beneath the level of the initiative to the institutions that are involved with implementing projects. And these are by and large countries themselves and financial institutions. Of course, the big Chinese policy banks, but equally the multilateral development banks. And we are just one of the multilateral development banks who will invest in the space of Belt and Road because there will be good projects. We as AIB will not invest in a project just because it is Belt and Road. We invest in a project if it has good returns and if it is environmentally and socially sound and otherwise a high quality project. Because we, as AIB, very different from an initiative, are a bank. So we have a balance sheet, we have a legal charter, and we have firm rules and policies that we have to work by. I mean, our bank has grown from 57 founding members to now 85 approved members. And we're little by little building up a bank that operates under clear multilateral governance rules and very clear project standards. So we're very pleased with how the build-up has gone, and I think the growing membership is sort of tribute to the growing confidence that AIB is truly a multilaterally governed institution. On the third initiative, the opening up of China's financial sector, I mean, just a few words. I mean, in one way, certainly the announcements and the increased clarity about timetable and the nature of opening up the financial sector to foreign investments in particular is welcome and is positive. And I'm sure will in particular be seen positively by the financial sector. But I also wouldn't overrate that particular announcement. I think there are reasons why the impact on China and on the region will be limited. One is that I think Chinese leadership will continue to put predominant emphasis on economic stability and control of financial risks, which means that capital account controls will in some form or another continue to exist and will have an influence on and will have a limiting factor on how much financial sector opening can actually achieve. Secondly, China is not an underdeveloped financial market. So the opening to foreign investment is not leading to the jump that happens in an underbanked country where you allow the foreign banking sector to enter. So again, therefore, I would not overestimate the impact that could come. I would think that other developments are probably bigger and more important for the region, other developments coming out of China. I think the changing trade composition related to the increasing cost of producing in China is really, really important for other Asian economies' development prospects. I think China's outward investment is quite important in terms of creating links within the region that are new. Even in the financial sector, if you look at, let's say, fintech investments from China into Southeast Asia, they would suggest that Southeast Asia will be banked much more like China in the future than like the West. And that has important implications that I think are important to recognize.
Thank you very much. So we've got 20 minutes left, and I know there are a lot of questions, so I have plenty more questions for our panel, but I wanted to open it up to the audience. And so if you can just state your name, what company you represent, if you do. The gentleman right there. You. Yes.
Thank you very much, Bill. Mahesh Kotecha, Structured.
You go next. That's what I meant.
Credit
Go on.
International. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to cut you off. My question really is about infrastructure. Senator Moreno mentioned something very, very important. Two things. One, $700 billion of pension fund money sitting idly by. And of course, there's in the US even larger amounts, 10 times. Globally, there's a lot of underinvested funds in low investment returns. At the same time, you also mentioned the capacity. I think others have talked about PPPs not being sufficient, being necessary for investments in infrastructure. There was a great construct in Asia, which I had the opportunity to found, called Asia Limited. It was a financial guarantee company rated single A. It was a guarantor like yours, like you can do, but it failed. And the US has had monolines also that failed. But there's been some successes there. So I would like to ask this question. In the US, monolines guaranteed $3 trillion of debt without a default before the financial crisis. It was for infrastructure. It was US infrastructure. There is a great precedent there for international infrastructure. I'd like to ask you, what can the multilaterals do to really go back to the original founding raison d'etre for multilaterals in the Bretton Woods period, which was to make guarantees, not loans. This has been lost. I'd like to ask whether this can be rejuvenated.
Well, real quick, and I'm sure Joaquin will have other ideas on that. When the financial crisis hit, we had to go into a number of countries and replace those monolines. But basically for us, they are booked, as I was saying earlier, as guarantees. So we do need that MIGA type instrument in today's age, where you can do not only public sector type guarantees, but private sector type guarantees, where you basically can look at the different risks and begin to have a way to price them differently. And we're going through that internal discussion and with our shareholders to see how we can set up something like this. But I totally agree with you. To me, that's one of the missing links. And when you go and talk to all the big pension funds, people who have appetite for long-term type of investments, that's the one missing thing that I find that has prevented us from being able to crowd in far more private sector money.
Okay.
I mean, our bank was set up to address this paradox of funds are available and need for the funds is there, but the two don't connect. And more, I mean, you mentioned the success of US infrastructure investments. Actually, if you look at the data, emerging country infrastructure is not more risky than advanced economies infrastructure. The empirical data is very, very clear. So the paradox is even starker. We sort of take three approaches to this. The first is the very traditional MDB approach, which is on balance sheet. we let institutional investors buy our bonds that we invest in emerging country infrastructure. That's the 70-year-old proven model. The second approach is co-investment and guarantees. With our participation, we give private co-investors the comfort that, in particular, political risks are managed and reduced, and therefore give them the comfort to invest. The third, and I think most promising, but also most challenging, is kind of really find instruments that open new markets toward the asset class that Isabel talked about. Just an example. Institutional investors are more likely to buy assets backed by operational cash flow generating assets rather than greenfield assets with a lot of construction risk. So we work on initiatives to take the assets of commercial banks, operating assets of commercial banks, repackage them, securitize them, sell them to institutional investors to let the commercial banks go back to do what they're best at, which is originating new projects. And we will be providing some credit enhancement that will make these newly generated securities attractive enough for private institutional investors to come in and buy them. Just one example of a huge agenda.
Very good.
Just one word on the subject of guarantees. I mean, I won't comment on, I think there's a genuine question of how to connect the funds with good projects. But your question, I think, suggests that there's an economic issue here. The monolines failed when it turned out that many of the things they guaranteed were correlated. And the question that has been raised about whether you can book a guarantee differently than a loan depends on, if you make 3 guarantees and they're big and they're all correlated, you got to book them like a loan. And so if this is where I think the MDB's thinking collaboratively about sharing their balance sheets, having more diversified portfolios, perhaps keeping the guarantees to modest size. There is, though, the irreducible problem that in certain circumstances, say commodity price decline that affects a large swath of emerging market and developing countries, or global downturn and so on and so forth. When the correlation shows up, the problem shows up.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Claire, if you'd like to make any comment.
No, I don't think there's any much more to add to what's been
Right.
said.
One of the things you might want to do, the next question is, if you want to refer this to the whole panel or just to one individual. Yes. My Sikh friend there, I did see you, but.
Thanks. My name is Vikranjeet Singh. I'm from New Rules for Global Finance. My question is to you. You mentioned China making fintech investments into Southeast Asia.
Can
everyone hear me?
Speak
No, I don't think they can.
just tell
Speak
them
more
speak
into that. I don't think they could hear you.
Yeah, it is on.
Just hold it closer, it's on.
Closer.
There you go.
Yeah, closer.
My question to you is about China making a lot of fintech investments into Southeast Asia and how that might change how Southeast Asia would bank in the future. If you could please elaborate on that. Thank you.
I guess that's to you, Joaquin.
Just a quick comment. When I moved to China 2 years ago, people still had cash in their wallets. Today they don't. I don't carry cash in China because you have your smart phone and you pay with WeChat and Alipay. Now it happens that the owners of those 2 companies are very significantly investing in similar ventures across Southeast Asia. If you look at the speed of spread of those technologies in China, where in 2 years payment systems have totally been transformed, it may not be as fast in other countries, but just brace yourself for the different kind of banking and payment system that you will probably see across Southeast Asia in 2-3 years, if not earlier.
Right. David?
I think this is a tremendous area for innovation, and we're seeing innovations in China and now spreading to South Asia and Southeast Asia that are in many respects ahead of what's happening in the United States and Europe. Some of it has the promise of promoting inclusion, overcoming remoteness. People who don't live anywhere near a bank can not only buy and sell things, but they can deposit money and they can borrow money and they can go into business, and that's a huge benefit. I'm sure, though, that as this spreads, Questions will arise about the impact of these platforms on existing banks, on existing institutions. Questions will arise about proper supervision and regulation. The Chinese themselves are very focused on this, and they will probably be the first to balance, to have to strike the balance between encouraging and enabling innovation that'll be really good for people and dealing with the byproducts, issues around financial stability risk, privacy of data, the security of payment systems, whether there's operational risk. In China, one entity conducts a very large fraction of all of the payments in the country. So if it were to have a glitch, it would be very significant. So I think we all need to be focused on the possibilities and enabling them, also watching out for the risks. And I think China and South and Southeast Asia are probably going to be the place where this first plays out.
I think we're in the midst of a revolution here. And we don't know where it's going or how long it's going to take, but it is a revolution without a doubt. Yes, over here. Yes.
My question is for David Lipton. You mentioned a huge growth in debt over the past period and unprecedented levels. At some point, and we heard President Kim earlier today talk about the elimination of muscle jobs and then the elimination of certain kinds of knowledge jobs. We've heard a lot of talk about perhaps national incomes, that sort of thing. Do we need to start to look at a different model for taxation for funding governments?
I'm not sure. I think that the question of domestic resource mobilization and the effects, efficiencies, and distortions of tax systems and the international harmonization of tax systems is a subject we're going to have to be on. There are some parts of the world where revenues are just too low a fraction of GDP to be able to both service your debt and pay for needed things, health, education, and infrastructure. There are countries where the tax systems are really, they raise enough revenue, but they're really inadequate and need to be reconfigured. In advanced economies, we've favored corporate tax reform in the United States for many years. One can quibble about exactly the features and so on and so forth. But there's also the risk that different corporate approaches to corporate taxation in different countries lead to a kind of deharmonization that's unhelpful in a world where capital is very mobile and where companies are operating in many countries and in the cloud. So I do think that it's an important project for the future to try to make tax systems stronger. I would only add that while this technology being developed by the private sector is revolutionary, it also may help governments do a lot better in many respects in terms of tax systems. I mean, think about trying to put in place a property tax in an emerging market or a developing country. We used to tell countries it takes 3 years to create a property cadastre, but when you've got GPS and satellites, it's better. In India and other places, having electronic technology and information technology and electronic identification may make both taxation and spending and the transmittal of benefits quicker, more efficient, and less prone to corruption. So I think that the good news here is that technology can be harnessed to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of fiscal policies, but it does have one requisite, which is that governments and legislatures are willing to provide enough resources to their revenue authorities to modernize. And for example, here in the United States, I'm not sure if it's true, but I was jokingly told that the IRS can't be hacked by cyber criminals because everything they have is in Fortran, and no one can read Fortran anymore. So the point being that there is the challenge that often it's hard for the public sector to keep up with the technologies being developed in the private sector, and that goes for tax administration as well. But there is a lot of promise in harnessing this technology.
Yeah, I think this is another major issue because we talk about these reforms in taxation, and the question is, do the revenue services have the ability, the fintech ability, to carry it forth? And that's a real question. Here in the United States, as you know, we had a delay of tax filing because the system broke down for a day. So they added one more day on. Some questions. Do we have any questions over here? We're going to get 5 minutes left here.
Gary Kleiman, we can't be at a Bretton Woods Committee meeting and not ask about exchange rates. And I wonder whether we talked about trade wars, and one of the indirect effects is currency is on that agenda, whether it's bilateral China, TPP, NAFTA. The regional arrangements, whether they're in Latin America, Asia, currency swap lines, new entrance into the single currency in Europe has been rather dormant, I suppose, for a few years. Do you see any prospect, whether it's through the trade channel or through just the normal integration process, particularly with local currency being so popular now in emerging markets and cross-border trade and investment, or for portfolio allocation? Do you see any sort of reactivation of a proactive currency coordination agenda?
I guess this is for the whole panel, so we will start with you, David, and move right through.
You know, our view is that flexible market-determined exchange rates have served the world very well in the last 15, 20 years and through this global financial crisis. And I think we don't really see a reason to shift away from that. That's not to say everyone has to have a floating exchange rate, but that it has served many countries very well in allowing for market-determined allocation of funds and in serving as a buffer, a shock absorber when things happen. That's not to say that currencies can't be pushed away from where they ought to be. Current accounts can't be pushed away from where they ought to be. We have a whole project, our external sector report, that tries to identify, especially where imbalances and or exchange rates are pushed away from where fundamentals would have them be because of policies that need to be adjusted. But we tend to focus on getting the policies right as a principal goal.
You've been very consistent on that, David, over the years. All the time you and I have worked together and I've known you. Claire, do you have any comments on that?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I would add to it, and I hate being the banker bringing up the global financial crisis, but then you saw central banks very closely coordinate around swap lines. So I concur with David.
Look, aside from agreeing on both of those things, what I find very interesting from what David just explained on flexible exchange rates is in the larger countries in Latin America, most countries are there, but that has equally allowed us to begin to do local currency lending. And that's a derivative of this, which is extremely good for debt management for governments, but equally for how we deal with foreign exchange risk when you look at long tenors for the private sector.
We learned that out of various debt restructuring problems, right, Luis Alberto?
Absolutely.
Joaquin?
Just, I think you've seen, in particular in Asia, huge amount of self-insurance, increasing reserves, Chiang Mai initiatives and the like, which are not dead. It's just that the days are sunny and reserves are high, so that's why there is not much talk about that. We see, similar to Latin America, very strong demand for local currency financing, which we as a new bank don't meet, unfortunately, yet, but would like to meet because we want to help countries manage their balance sheets and avoid that countries accumulate exchange rate mismatches for local currency generating assets. So for us, it's a very important agenda.
I've been told we have a few more minutes because our next speaker hasn't arrived, and I know, Luis Alberto, you have to leave. and I thank you very much. But if we have another question over here. Yes, the lady with her hand up. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, como siempre.
Hi, this is Mia Lu from Eurasia Group. I have a question for Dr. von Emsberg. So I know AIIB was set up as a multinational development bank with green genes, but when the bank makes investments, people always view it as like Chinese money. So how would the institution convince stakeholders that it's not like Chinese money? I know it's on paper, but how to convince stakeholders and the audience that it's not Chinese money? And I will also want to further ask a question. So like for the past projects that AIIB has approved, it has been like cooperating with the peers like the World Bank Group and ADB as well. I would ask like 5 years from now, how would you see this bank like balance the Chinese color and its cooperation or relationship with its peers? Thank you.
No, thanks for asking the question. It's on many people's minds. China initiated AIIB, and that's the fact. China has been able to bring 56 other founding members on board. Those other founding members agreed to join AIIB because of two reasons. One, commitment to true multilateral governance and decision-making, and two, commitment to international project quality standards. I will repeat that here, but in the end, it's our record that has to speak to the credibility of those statements. China is now, with 25% of the shareholding, our largest shareholder, followed by India, Russia, Germany, Korea, Indonesia, and so the list goes on. I think over the course of our 2 years of operations, other countries have sort of found the arrangements credible, where China is our largest shareholder, but in no way dominating the institution. Just like in other multilateral banks, there's typically a largest shareholder, but even that largest shareholder cannot impose decisions on the institution because there happen to be, and that's the beauty of multilateral institutions, there happen to be many other members who have to form a consensus on important decisions. We will increasingly be able to refer to our actual operational practice to give credibility to our multilateral governance. So just two numbers that may surprise you. First, we made the largest share of our loans so far to India. It happens to be the country that has demanded the most of us. There's no particular strategic direction in there, but it's certainly surprising to some. Secondly, just a few days ago, I got the numbers of which are the companies, or in which countries are the companies based who win most AIIB finance procurement contracts. And I was surprised, it was Turkey. So, I mean, again, what happens in AIIB is just what happens in multilateral practice. Contracts get bid out, and the best bidder wins. And I think that's the way it should be, and that's the way AIIB works. And the fact that we have more than 20 new members that have joined us, countries like Canada, Belgium, and other countries, is tribute to, I think, the multilateral governance that has really worked quite well over the last couple of years. On 5 years forward, we will probably have less co-financing with multilateral banks. Right now, about 60% of our financing is jointly with World Bank, EBRD, ADB, and EIB, other multilaterals. That will probably shrink to maybe a quarter or a third, because it will be more driven by where is the need for multiple banks rather than by our still very weak staff capacity. We're 170 staff, so we cannot possibly pretend to have the capacity to help prepare structure projects all over the world in multiple sectors. So we have to very much rely on partnerships with existing institutions who have been very, very gracefully and effectively cooperating with us, so we are very thankful for that. But over time, I think we will play a larger role in the origination of projects, which MDBs typically play an important role in.
I won't ask you when the United States is going to join because...
Well, I think there are probably in this room many people who can answer that question. We can only say we are open. Our charter is very clear. AIIB membership is open to any country that is a member of the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. And of course, that includes the United States. And all countries who aren't members yet will always be welcome to join.
Thank you very much. Anyway, I think we've run out of time. I want to thank this panel, give them all a big hand, and thank David for hosting us. Thank you. Thank you for coming all the way from the UK. Thanks, David.
It's good to see you again.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. You well? Everything good?
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill, and our very good panel.
You can push my book instead of giving me a shot.
Our next panel will be hosted by Axel Weber, the chairman of UBS, at the present time with a great career as the chairman, the former chairman of the Bundesbank, a great central banker. And he will be introducing our principal speaker, Randall Quarles. And I will not do that except to note that Randall Quarles was, up until his appointment as vice chair, a very active member of the Bretton Woods Committee, and he participated in the work of the committee for quite some time. So it's something that we are very proud to note. And I assume that both of them are in the wings. Is that true? Well, let's, Axel? Oh, they are miking them up. Good, good. There we go. Welcome back to the committee.
Well, it's a pleasure being here, and Richard, thanks. We were behind the curtain so we could hear you. Thanks for the kind announcement and the introduction. It's a pleasure being here at this conference, and what we wanted to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to very briefly open up with very small opening statements and then move to a conversation. And I had the pleasure to do this with Randy before at a different occasion, so I'm very much looking forward to the conversation later on. But let me tee it up maybe just by giving a bit of background. Where do we stand? If you look at where the world economy is today, both in terms of global growth, but also in terms of the global regulatory and financial reforms, I'm actually very hopeful that we will be in a better place for the next 2 to 3 years than the one we've been in for a long time. Overall, we see the global economy is still in a broad-based, pretty synchronized and strong upswing, despite some of the weak first quarter results that we're seeing come in the major developed markets, the US and Europe. Our base case is an upswing that will continue for the foreseeable future, at least a runway of another 1 to 2 years that is pretty clear in my view, bearing risks. However, having said that, the benign economic forecasts that we see are subject to exceptional high risk and uncertainty, such as a looming dispute over trade, European uncertainties around the Italian elections or Brexit, geopolitical tensions, and in the longer term, the potential adverse consequences of, for example, late cycle US fiscal stimulus or emerging larger twin deficits. Therefore, it's not surprising that when you look at the risk, many of them being on the downside, that you need to be cautious despite the fact that you have a probably good and better than for many years outlook for the economy. But let's move to something that is closer to the round of what we'll discuss, and that is the regulatory reform and the evolving framework for doing business for the financial industry. And when we look what had happened, and in one of my previous capacities, I was one of the people that was around in 2007 in an official sector role when the crisis hit. And if you've seen the financial system and the stress that emanated at the time, it is very clear to everyone that the coordinated overhaul of the global regulatory framework that has been delivered and has delivered very important reform was a necessary set of reforms, and it needed to happen. It has made financial institutions more resilient, it has made markets safer, and it's the right direction of travel. But with every direction of travel, there is a point in time at which you ask whether you just want to continue that journey or whether you should slightly change the direction or the speed of travel. Now that many of the reforms are in place, I think we're at a good point in time to assess what has been achieved so far, to ask ourselves what can be and needs to be done in the future. And from my perspective, there are a number of key questions that I would like to start, and I'm very grateful that Randy Grauls, the Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, is with us here today, that he's open for a number of questions. He will start with an initial statement, but I'll just put a few of those questions out. How do we ensure a consistent implementation of the agreed reforms, for example, the Basel package that has been agreed in December? How can we deal with any consequences of a reform that are unintended? Because whilst many of the reforms that I just said were necessary and led to a much safer environment, there are side effects, and those side effects should be addressed. How do we address the increasing risk of regulatory fragmentation? We're now at a very challenging point in time where an agreed upon global framework, and in brackets, there was already a lot of discussion about the final compromises, so they're not a bliss point of where everyone wanted to end it. They are true compromises, and people had envisaged quite a different set of rules in the end. How do we make sure that that set of compromises is implemented in a consistent fashion across the globe? It clearly needs, from the side of the financial industry, who is very supportive of these endeavors, it clearly needs a very much coordinated international regulatory response. And this is why I think it's very good for us to be here. So before we go to the Q&A, it's my pleasure to ask Randy to make a few opening statements on, you've seen him probably on the record. He's sort of given both a speech and also gave testimony. So many of the issues we're going to talk about, he's already teed up, and you saw it in the press the last 2 days. So maybe just for your benefit, I ask him to tee up a few of the issues he wants to talk about, and then we move to some debate.
I'll be very brief. Thank you for that. And on the regulatory front, I think the main sort of framing message that I have is one that I know you have heard me say before, and maybe some others in the audience, but I think is an important way of sort of orienting ourselves at this moment in time with respect to regulation. And that is immediately after the crisis and and not so immediately in the post-crisis period that's now lasted almost a decade, the focus has been on the safety and soundness of the financial sector, and that's appropriately so. And there's been a body of post-crisis regulation that's been put in place that in the core areas of improving the capital in the system and creating a focus on liquidity, both at the firms and in the regulators that had not been there before, and improving the resolvability of firms. In each of those areas, that body of post-crisis regulation and that post-crisis effort has been positive and I think successful. But what hasn't been as high on the priority list is what I think is the equally strong public interest in the efficiency of the financial sector. And at this moment, it's a perfectly appropriate time, given the strength of the economy, given where we are and having just completed the Basel III reforms, the last steps in the Basel III reforms. Therefore, we can basically say that the body of post-crisis regulation is complete, to stand back and now, with the benefit of experience and hindsight, to say, how can we achieve these objectives more efficiently? With an eye towards the efficiency of the financial sector. We'll always be able to improve in any of our endeavors. All of us have worked on many large projects in our lifetimes, and in any such project, you stand back and you say, I can achieve this part of it better. and this element that I thought was going to be so critical turns out to have been utterly irrelevant, and this thing that was basically a side thought turns out to be much more important, and these two measures that, I see that they're pulling at cross purposes in ways that I hadn't intended, and adjusting in light of that experience in order to achieve your objectives more effectively and efficiently is sheer responsible regulation, and how I at least see the regulatory reform effort. It's not a question of deregulating, it's not a question of swinging a pendulum back, it's a question of achieving objectives with an eye towards efficiency, and I think that that can significantly reduce the burden on the financial sector, but do it in a way that doesn't impair the achievement of those other objectives of safety and soundness.
Yeah, so let me start by asking there, I saw some of your statements yesterday, and you seem to hint at increasingly looking at a different set of regulations for GSIBs and for global banks, and having a more tiered system and a more differentiated system for less global systemic, say national systemic, or even at the national level, less systemic banks. Is that tiered system something that you see evolving over here in regulation, and what areas is it largely going to cover?
So I think that to some extent we have always had that here. To a greater extent than has been the case in Europe, for example, we have applied kind of international standards differentially to our smaller banks versus our larger banks here. I think part of thinking about the efficiency of this system, though, is to be even more tailored, is the sort of term of art that we are using here, in the application of regulation to financial institutions, to ensure that the character of the regulation that we're applying is appropriate to the risk and size and systemic importance of the institution to which it's being applied. And therefore, that's not just a distinction between GSIBs and non-GSIBs, really, but along the continuum of risk and size, I think that we can sort of be more granular in how we apply regulation to all of these institutions.
And that will not just involve capital, that will be liquidity, that will be other forms of regulation that you're implementing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, on the specific question of liquidity, for example, right now we do have sort of a cliff vesting at about institutions that are, in our system, relatively small, have the same framework of liquidity regulation that's applied to them as is applied to the very largest institutions, and that probably isn't necessary in order to achieve our safety and soundness objectives.
Another sort of point that came up in the last 2 days or in the last week that has been discussed here is that for global SIFIs, sort of capital buffers that they have been holding have largely been, unanimous across the field. People talk about minimum requirements, and in my view, talked about minimum requirements too much, because above that minimum requirements, there are tailored requests for capital buffers, largely coming from stress tests and other scenarios. So how you see that play out in the US, and do you see that system becoming internationally? Because we have a very similar system in Switzerland. Does that system of supplementing stress tests and getting capital answers from basically asking the question, how much capital do you need to be credibly resolvable, will that be sort of the standard that drives the capital requirement?
Well, I think that would be very sensible if that were to evolve internationally. As you know, just last week, we proposed basically the integration of our sort of kaleidoscopic capital regime. We had 24 different capital ratios, and we proposed integrating them into a single regime that would sort of have minimum capital levels and a stress buffer on top of that. That would be determined pursuant to annual stress tests. And while there are pros and cons to both different types of structures, I do think that is a much simpler, more comprehensible, more workable regime fundamentally. So I think there'd be benefits to seeing that across more jurisdictions.
Systemic risk is a key concern for many of the regulators. And so we talk a lot about banking system and systemic risk. Do you see other pockets of risk or even systemic risk emerge in financial markets outside the core banking system that you're focused on?
So I'd say right now, as we look at risk across the financial sector, not just the banking system, I think that we're, our assessment of financial stability risks right now is that, that they're moderate, basically by historical standards. They're kind of in the average range. Asset valuations are obviously pretty high, particularly for some categories of assets, stocks, commercial real estate. But the amount of leverage that those assets are supporting, particularly financial sector leverage, is not particularly high. The system itself is a lot more resilient precisely because we have a lot more capital, a lot more liquidity in the system. So, as we look at what risks are out there across the broader financial sector, and that includes the unregulated part of the financial sector, we're vigilant. It's not that they're low, but we think that the risks are only moderate.
One of the key discussions outside banks, in particular, has been central counterparties. And sort of CCP supervision is one area where, in a market-based system, there's a lot of focus on. Do you see other areas where sort of regulation, once it moves beyond the perimeters of banking, will focus on? Asset management, market-based finance, or do you think there is a real good reason why those are regulated differently to the core of the banking system?
So when we're looking at systemic risk, I think that the most fruitful way, then there are devils in the details as to exactly how you accomplish it, but it's less are there types of institutions that we ought to be reaching out and regulating, and more are there activities that we think can create systemic risk that can be accomplished in a variety of different types of institutions, and how can we regulate those activities when we think that they pose systemic issues, in a way that's kind of cross institution. And so in the United States we have the FSOC, which has a process for reaching out, but I think that it should not, if it's thinking about designating something that's not currently regulated as a systemic issue, it's less, is it an asset management institution, is it an insurance company, and really, is it an activity that's posing a systemic issue, and regulating that activity, designating that activity, if you will.
Some of the banks that I talk to, and I see Tim Adams in the audience, and that we talk to at the IF, are really concerned about regulatory fragmentation going forward. Is that a concern you share, or maybe put it slightly differently, do you actively, from the Federal Reserve side, work towards avoiding that fragmentation and discussing with peers in Basel on how to move to a much of a level playing field for the global banks? I mean, that's the area where we're most focused.
Yes, and I think that that's that's very important. I think that the Federal Reserve generally has, but I certainly think that going forward that we need to be engaged in the international fora where these or the rules that will have global applicability are discussed, precisely to ensure that we have a level playing field for our institutions, and other countries have the same interest in participating for their institutions, to ensure that global stability risks that could risks that could be posed to the United States, that we also are satisfied with the regulatory regime that's managing those. So I think it's very much in our U.S. national interest to be fully engaged in those fora, and when we have issues with with particular regulatory proposals, we should discuss them in those fora, as opposed to making our purely internal decisions and deciding to deviate from them.
And I would guess most of the central banks and most of the regulators we talk to would be in the same place. The tricky issue is, once implementation of these international rules moves to national jurisdictions, you have policymakers involved, and you need to pass laws, and here Congress and the Senate get involved, and what you put into the process might not be what comes out of the process. So how do you ensure a maximum of consistency of that process, and which extends really beyond your own sphere of influence?
Well, it does, but I think that's part of our job as national regulators. Is I'm not entirely sure how the narrative has developed, which it has developed in the United States, is that we sort of go into these international fora and we lose and end up having to come back with unsatisfactory regulatory proposals that we're expected to implement in the United States. My experience has generally been that when people are unhappy with what the U.S. has brought into the international regulatory fora, with what the U.S. brings out of the international regulatory fora, it's because they're unhappy with what the U.S. took into the international regulatory fora. And that therefore our job domestically is to ensure that we're in continuous communication with the legislature, with stakeholders, with the banks, with the community representatives, to take all of that into the international discussions, and then ensure that we're satisfied with the level playing field that results. And if we do it that way, if we have a very transparent process here, and if we encourage transparency in the processes of these international fora as well, we'll have much greater success in making the case that these are rules that are in our interest, not rules that are being imposed upon us.
And it's interesting, I mean, coming from Switzerland, which is where our home market is, clearly in Switzerland there is the perception that we're rule takers in these international fora, but it's interesting to hear that the United States of America has the same feeling about being a rule taker in these. It's not quite probably how these committees work, and as you say, I remember from my own time on these committees, there is a robust debate amongst the key regulators, and we see it on our colleges, that many of them are actually in a very similar place, because it's very important to have no arbitrage between regulatory entities, and that, I think, really drives these compromise. Since it's a very sort of differentiated crowd, it's different interests, let me sort of move from the core of your responsibilities and what we as banks are interested in to a more broader setting, cryptocurrencies.
Yes.
We talked about that in our last conversation. You were very clear sort of how you look at that. Maybe just share your view with the crowd here on how you see that evolve. And at the time when we talked, which was before December, there hasn't been a lot of talk about sort of moving to a more regulatory-based framework for that, but things have been on the move since then. So where does the Fed stand now?
So with respect to cryptocurrencies, I guess we're told. I was told at one point to call them crypto assets, and then they were crypto something else. And so whatever these crypto things are, so right now, as a systemic matter, they don't pose particular issues, right? I mean, they are not deeply integrated into the payment system. Despite all the press that's associated with them, they aren't particularly large enough to have macro effects in the financial sector or in the economy. Clearly, serious issues about consumer protection, given the speculative valuations that are assigned to a lot of them. Very serious issues about the financing of criminal activity, that are important to governments, and but of financial stability risk, they don't really pose one. Now, as you said, it's a rapidly evolving, rapidly moving area, and so we're monitoring it closely. But right now, our principal concern would be to find ways to address those consumer protection and criminal financing risks. And we don't have a particularly good regulatory structure in this country for addressing those risks for cryptocurrencies. It's not perfectly clear that they count as securities for the SEC to regulate them. There are a couple of futures contracts on them now, which gives the CFTC a certain hook on regulating them, at least from consumer protection, but a limited hook. There are questions as to exactly how you regulate the underlying spot market. Since they don't pose a particular they aren't a particularly important part of the payment system. Our rules and so forth govern the payment system, don't really create a hook. So, we are wrestling with how to address what we see as the concerns, given our existing regulatory framework, and I think that most of the countries of the world are. They have similar issues.
And, in addition to all the weaknesses you outlined, every time I'm on a panel with the Secretary of the Treasury, he reminds all the banks in the room that as far as cryptocurrencies are concerned, AML, KYC obligations are the same as for any engagement with a counterparty. And so what is reassuring is actually when I read sort of across the headlines over the recent months, there are new forms of digital currencies emerging that are just addressing all these weaknesses and that try and set themselves aside from these initial offerings by basically filling some of the voids or solving some of the problems that were associated. And that's financial innovation, I think, in a positive sense.
With respect to the idea of cryptocurrencies, kind of non-government supported currencies, I do think that, tulips are still with us, right? I mean, they're beautiful flowers. They still have value, and maybe at the time that we get to the other side of the bubble, there will be some enduring value, to be developed from this type of an asset.
And fintech, sort of in a more broader setting, just not focusing on digital or cryptocurrencies, there's quite a differentiated approach among major jurisdictions towards fintechs and startups. Singapore, one of the early nations that with Sandbox enabled some of these developments. Switzerland, where we're placed, very strong drive towards attracting fintech. Where do you see them in terms of regulation? Too small to matter some time ago, too large to ignore now, or do you still see that as a sort of grassroots development that can largely continue to be unregulated?
So, with respect to fintech, at least in the United States, I don't view it as completely unregulated because most of the various fintech companies that have sprouted up, they are interfaces in one way or another to the existing banking system, right? They improve the consumer interface, in various ways, but at one point they either for funding capacity or for connection to the payment system, they are backed by a bank for the most part, not always, but for the most part. And through that connection, we do have regulatory insight into what's happening there. We have the ability to, in many cases, to look directly at the activities of those companies, and other parts of our regulatory apparatus have even more direct capacity to regulate them. So they aren't completely unregulated. I do think, again, that part of our obligation as regulators is to not only allow but encourage the development of innovation, particularly what looks to be consumer-friendly innovation. So I'm not sure that our existing structure may be just about right for that.
Right. And we see that everywhere. I mean, we in the financial industry are seeing fintechs become part of our value chain, and so that they're innovating parts where we as large financial institutions have been less innovative. Yeah. And so I think that it's a very well-versed set of enterprises that are developing there. Large TechFin, sort of large companies move into financial services. How do you see that evolve?
So that's a different thing, I think we are very, at very early stages. We're at very early stages in the actual evolution of that, and so we're at very early stages in how we think about that evolving. But it's certainly conceivable, that evolves in a way that's much different than, creating some interface that tacks on to the existing financial infrastructure. And in some significant way disintermediates or reimagines, the connection between counterparties of a sort that's traditionally been performed by financial intermediaries, and so that could raise issues to the extent that is done on a fractional reserve basis, right? And if it's not done on a fractional reserve basis, it's hard to see how it can really then be competitive with the existing financial sector. And if it is done on a fractional reserve basis, it will raise many of the same issues that call for regulation of the financial sector. They will raise many of the same issues. So I think we have to wait and see how that evolves. But I think that is a much bigger issue and will ultimately be a much bigger challenge for regulation than what we currently think of as fintech.
I see Richard and Bill in the first row, and they were very clear with me that I should open for questions. So I will, because that's an old Bretton Woods Committee tradition, so I'll do that right now because I don't want to have this conversation without you having the chance to ask questions. Please identify yourselves, who you are, and there's 2 hands back there, so we start with the microphones right there. The lady.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that any entities outside of banking that could potentially pose a systemic risk, it would be because of activities rather than the type of institution. I was just wondering, could you point to any activities in particular that you think would be worth looking at for potentially posing a systemic risk?
So that's something that would be considered in the FSOC, and I don't want to prejudge those discussions. The FSOC right now, as you know, is in the process of thinking about exactly how one would create the framework for designating an activity as opposed to an institution. And there's more work that needs to be done there. So I won't front run that discussion.
There was another hand, Dino.
Thank you. So Dino Coase from CLS Bank. My question is about the yield curve. So we've had this massive flattening of the yield curve from about 250 a while ago to about 40 now. It's heading downwards, it seems like. As you know, before every recession in the last several cycles, whenever we've had a flattening or minor inversion of the curve, we've had a recession follow. So my question is, what are your thoughts about that? And does that suggest that we might be later in the cycle than economic models would suggest?
So, I think when you go back and look at those historical instances, I think a lot of it depends on what's driving the flattening of the yield curve as to whether it's going to, be a reliable signal of a recession. Now, at some point, even a stopped clock is right twice a day, but, and there is still a business cycle. But I think that the flattening of the yield curve we're seeing now is more a result of, kind of expected lags in sort of the adjustment of the longer-term rates once shorter-term rates start to rise. And if that's kind of what's driving things going forward, I don't think it's as likely that the inversion of the yield curve is a reflection of sort of an indicator of a recession to come. So. Obviously, it's something that we are looking at, and if you were to have an extended, even if it were not as a signaling factor, if you were to have an inverted yield curve for an extended period of time, right, then that in itself could have effects on the financial sector that that could then lead to sort of a lack of support for real economic activity. But I'm not viewing the current flattening of the yield curve as a particular signal towards impending recession.
There's a question back there.
Having listened, Danny Galino from Mace News, having listened to you yesterday in the testimony, I know you walk a fine line. You have to reassure the Republicans and not disappoint the Democrats too much. But could you just outline what, from your point of view, you think your main departure is from the approach of Governor Tarullo?
Where to begin? So I think that I guess I'd say I don't want to over-characterize what Governor Tarullo's approach would be. Some of the proposals that we have made and will make over the coming months and year, I would not be surprised if he supported, and others he might have reservations about. So I'm not going to delve too deeply into the mind of Dan. But I do think that the emphasis on the public interest in the efficiency of the system is something that has not been a high priority message or of the Federal Reserve or the regulatory system generally over the course of the last decade, post-crisis. And I do think that it's something that going forward will be a lens through which we look at all of both existing regulation and our regulatory proposals going forward. It will be a much larger factor than it has been in the recent past.
And actually, just to chime that, if I may, that is true even outside the US across most of the jurisdictions, because what we've seen in Europe as well was a re-regulation that was largely, first and foremost, looking at safety and soundness. And as that was in place and the side effects that emerged, the efficiency of the system and the financial system to do its intermediary role became right center stage as a result of that first round of regulations. And so I think this is something that you're seeing across jurisdictions, where now the efficiency of the regulation is a lot more in the focus than the regulation itself. There were further questions? Richard. Microphone here.
Thank you. As a result of the crisis, there have been a lot of regulatory changes that have taken place, both legislative and regulatory by the agencies, the Fed in particular, and globally as well. Those that have aimed at prevention of another crisis have been focused upon and dealt with, are being dealt with. That's exactly what we've been talking about now. And I think that conversation is a very healthy one, very fruitful one. I like your idea of focusing on the efficiency of the system, something that has been neglected, there's no doubt about it. And it's not a question of pendulum swinging back and forth between tightness and liberalness, so forth. But there's a whole other problem out there that I see as a result of the crisis, and it's mostly legislation, and it's mostly in the US, not abroad. And that is the constraints that have been placed on the regulatory agencies, the Fed and the FDIC in particular, to deal with an emergency if it should come. And that is not impossible. I mean, all of these other measures, they're great for what they are, but it's not impossible we'll have another crisis. It could come from anywhere, not the least of which could be a major cyber attack on the banking system, and there'd be chaos. The Fed's powers, emergency powers to deal with the crisis, have been limited by the Congress, the FDIC as well. Is that on the agenda? Do people begin to think about that? It's not, I mean, it's a highly unlikely event, but it could happen. And if it does happen, and you, the regulators, can't deal with it with the tools you have, and they've been cut back from what they have been for many decades, there would really be a problem. And I know this can't be a first priority in the agenda of the legislators, but is it something that the Fed has got on its agenda, long-term agenda?
So, history would tell us that we will, in fact, likely at some point, we will not know the date of its coming, but we will likely have another crisis at some point. So how we respond to a crisis, given the tools that we have, is something that we do think about a lot and think about with other regulators, both within the United States and internationally as well. So we have given a lot of thought as to how we can respond. We have tabletop exercises where we work out, okay, given the tools that we have. I would say that while the response toolkit of the regulators has been changed, we aren't without tools. And part of the part of the reason for these exercises is to determine exactly how to use the tools that we have. So, so I would not be, I wouldn't be too negative about our ability to respond in the future. What we have to do is sort of ensure that the tools that we have, that we know how to use them. We're kind of, we know where the hammer is in order to break the glass, should that become necessary. And we do engage in those sorts of exercises all the time.
I think we can take one or two more questions, please.
Thank you. Rich Miller from Bloomberg. What are the implications of the drive to make the financial industry more efficient and to significantly reduce the burden on the financial sector for monetary policy?
Well, at one level, that's a very simple question, and another level, that's an incredibly complex question. So I'll give the simple answer. I think that to the extent that that we have an efficiently functioning financial sector, that we actually improve our ability to pass through monetary policy. I also think that the reverse is true. As we normalize monetary policy, I think that actually helps the efficient functioning of the financial sector, particularly our smallest banks that are most sensitive to the level of interest rates and to the slope of the yield curve. Ultimately, our policy normalization will create a better environment for their operation, and then on the flip side, an efficient regulatory sector and an efficient regulatory system and a healthy financial sector creates a more efficient transmission mechanism for monetary policy. So we view them as basically mutually supportive. And then at some time we can get into a much more complex question, overly granular for this forum, about the relationship of liquidity regulation and balance sheet normalization and all of that.
One last question over there, please.
Hi, John Heltman with American Banker. You touched on this a little bit in your testimony yesterday about the granting of charters, ILC charters. I wondered if you could say whether you, why wouldn't you grant an ILC charter? What kind of an ILC charter might you object to, and what might be the nature of those? And a sort of related question, going back to the now former acting controller, Noreika, gave a speech regarding the barrier between commercial and financial systems. Is that something you think about? Do you think that those barriers might be something that should be reconsidered more generally?
So on the ILCs, I would look at the granting of an ILC charter. I think we should apply the same, the same measures of assessment that we apply to the granting of a charter of any other financial institution. The safety and soundness of the business model and the confidence in the management and all the assessments that would generally go into that. I don't view them as a particularly special or excessively problematic case. There are certain specific issues to them, but the basic granting of a charter should be the same. On the larger question of banking and commerce, I thought that former acting controller Noreika, that's quite a mouthful, Keith's speech was, I thought that it was quite interesting. I haven't given a lot of thought as to two proposals along those lines because I don't think that they're currently politically practicable. But I thought his speech was quite interesting.
One of the expectations of bringing a German Swiss banker on here is to end on time. And I'll do that here. And let me, on all of your behalf, thank Vice Chairman Randy Krols for giving us some insight into the Fed's view. I understand from Richard that there will be drinks afterwards, so I don't want to stand between you and drinks. And Richard, with that, we pass back to you.
Oh, that's my message. Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you. And there will be drinks. There will be a reception now, beginning now. And all of us at the committee want to thank our speakers of this particularly scintillating discussion. It was. And also to thank the UBS, if I may, thank the chairman here in person for sponsoring, helped to sponsor, and of course our friends from SICPA who have been so faithful a sponsor over the years. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to talking again and again between now and the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference. So let's go have a drink. Thank you.
Very good.